The marble floor of the Hanuel Imperial Hotel's grand ballroom was cold enough to make your bones ache, but nobody in that room was thinking about the cold. They were thinking about the gun. One of Ji-ho's own guards had fired into the ceiling, not on purpose, not on any order. Just a man whose hand startled when his boss, the most controlled human being any of them had ever stood next to, suddenly grabbed Captain Adrian Vale by the collar and slammed him against the wall hard enough to crack the marble's decorative trim. The chandelier above them swayed. Crystal trembled. Champagne sloshed over the rims of glasses held by politicians, investment bankers, crime family representatives, and corporate executives who had spent their entire careers learning to show nothing on their faces. And every single one of them flinched. The thing that broke Kwon Ji-ho wasn't money. It wasn't a power play. It wasn't a threat against his territory or a move against the Mujin Syndicate's operations. It was 3 words spoken by a woman in a green dress. I don't know. If you've ever watched someone you love look at another person the way you always hoped they'd look at you, drop everything you're doing and stay with this story. And if you haven't met this channel yet, subscribe right now, hit that like button, and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels, because you do not want to miss what happens next. 3 years before the night, a gun went off in a ballroom, and every criminal organization in New York City started talking. Zora Whitfield walked into the Mujin International Corporate Tower on a Tuesday morning carrying a travel mug that had seen better days, a leather portfolio that cost her 2 weeks of savings, and the kind of focused expression that people with no backup plan wear when they absolutely cannot afford to fail. She was 31 years old. She had paid her own way through college and a business administration certificate program by working double shifts at a hotel front desk. She had no family connections to anyone inside Mujin International. She had no contact inside Ji-ho's organization who could smooth her path or whisper her name into the right ear. She had a resume, a firm handshake, and the ability to type 112 words per minute under pressure, which she had demonstrated during the hiring assessment without breaking eye contact with the evaluator once. She got the job as executive secretary to Kwon Ji-ho, one of 5 executive secretaries assigned to him at different times that year, because no one lasted. Zora lasted. The first time she met Ji-ho directly was not dramatic. He entered the executive floor at 7:43 in the morning, 12 minutes ahead of his scheduled arrival, which she had already anticipated because she had read his assistant's notes from the previous 4 months. She had his coffee waiting at the right temperature. She had already redistributed his 9 o'clock meeting to 11 because his prior commitment would run over, and she had done it without being asked because the math was obvious to anyone paying attention. He looked at the coffee. He looked at the revised schedule printout already sitting on the corner of his desk. He looked at her once. You moved the 9 o'clock. Your Inchin call typically runs long. If it doesn't, the 11 holds. If it does, you're not walking into a conference room 30 minutes behind before the workday is properly started. He said nothing. He sat down. He picked up the coffee. She walked out. That was it. That was their entire first interaction. No warmth, no approval, no acknowledgement that she had done something correct or smart or efficient. Just a man drinking coffee and a woman returning to her desk. She went home that night and told herself it was fine. She had not come here to be praised. She had come here to do a job that no one else had managed to hold on to, and she intended to hold on to it. What she did not tell herself, because she was too careful and too practical to say things like this out loud, even to herself, was that there was something in the way Kwon Ji-ho moved through a room that made her want to understand him. Not fix him, not soften him, just understand the architecture of a man that controlled. She understood already, even that first week, not only a legitimate corporate empire spanning 14 countries, but something significantly older and more dangerous underneath it. The kind of organization whose members nodded too carefully when certain names were said. The kind where security was never just security. Zora was not naive. She had grown up in a neighborhood where you learned early which things you asked about and which things you didn't. She filed what she knew, set it in a separate column in her mind, and kept working. The second week, she caught an error. Not a small error. A discrepancy inside a series of vendor contracts that, if left alone, would have triggered an audit flag inside the company's legitimate financial filings. The kind of flag that invited federal attention. It was buried 7 layers deep inside language that had been drafted by a contract attorney billing $400 an hour, and it had been missed by 2 senior financial officers. Zora was not a financial officer. She was an executive secretary. She found it because she read everything that crossed Ji-ho's desk, and she read everything because that was the only way to do the job correctly. She flagged it. Not loudly. She wrote a 3-line summary, attached the relevant sections, and placed it inside Ji-ho's morning review folder with a small tab labeled Attorney. Review recommended. He called her into his office at 11 that morning. How did you find this? I read the contracts. These contracts were reviewed by people whose entire function is to read contracts. Yes. She let that sit. He studied her for a moment. Not in the way some of the men in the office studied her. The ones who looked at her like they were already drafting the joke they'd tell later. The ones whose eyes swept her body and came back with the particular kind of dismissal that people who have never been dismissed pretend they don't understand. Ji-ho looked at her the way someone looks at an equation they haven't solved yet. Fix it, he said, quietly. She did. She didn't mention it again. She didn't expect acknowledgement, and she didn't receive any. But from that week forward, something shifted in how Ji-ho's calendar operated. Her access expanded. Documents she previously would have received in summary form started arriving in full. His travel scheduler began coordinating with her directly instead of routing through 2 layers of administrative assistance. Nobody officially changed her title. Nobody announced anything. The machine simply adjusted around her the way machinery does when one component proves more load-bearing than originally calculated. She noticed the other executive secretaries watching her sometimes. Not with friendship. There was a particular kind of resentment that happens in environments where proximity to power is the primary currency. And Zora had accumulated proximity faster than anyone expected, and without performing the rituals they understood. The deference, the careful flattery, the meticulous management of which battles to avoid. She just worked. She just showed up. She just refused to disappear. Some of them assumed it was something else. Women who looked like them, lighter, slimmer, more closely aligned with what the glamorous world around Ji-ho considered visually appropriate, had worked near him for years without earning what Zora appeared to earn in weeks. That required an explanation they were comfortable with. The explanation they settled on was manipulation. That she had found some angle. That she was playing a long game. She was playing a long game. It was just competence, which they had decided ahead of time was unavailable to someone who looked like her, and so they kept searching for the other explanation. Zora heard the whispers eventually. You always do. The building's walls weren't that thick and people weren't that subtle. She did not confront anyone. She did not complain to Ji-ho. She went home, sat with the familiar weight of it. Familiar because it was not new. It was just a different building with better furniture. And she returned the next morning and did her job better than she had done it the day before. This was the part nobody ever wrote down anywhere, the cost of the discipline, the price of the performance, the fact that being excellent under conditions designed to make you feel small is not effortless, no matter how effortlessly it reads from the outside. Some mornings she sat in her car in the parking structure for 3 minutes before walking in, because 3 minutes was what she needed to build the wall back up to height. Some evenings she drove home replaying something that had been said in a corridor, and her hands would tighten on the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. She kept going, because this was the job, and she had not come this far to flinch in a parking structure. By the end of the first year, Ji-ho trusted her more than he trusted men who had carried his family's interests for 2 decades. This was not sentiment, it was calculation. He was a man who ran on calculation. She had demonstrated a pattern of behavior that was reliable, accurate, and the part that mattered most to a man whose entire existence was built around anticipating threats, loyally quiet. She solved problems without making the solving of them a display. She protected his interests without requiring credit for the protection. What he had not calculated was what that particular combination of qualities does to a person after long enough. There are people you interact with and they remain at a certain distance, polite, functional, categorized. And then there are people who, through the daily accumulation of shared pressure and quiet competence, and the specific intimacy of knowing someone's patterns better than they know them themselves, stop being at a distance. They move from the professional register into something that doesn't have a clean business category. Ji-ho, who had spent his entire adult life maintaining absolute categorical clarity about every person around him, did not notice when Zora moved. He noticed when she was not there. There was a Tuesday in the second year when she had a medical appointment and was out of the office until midday. He had 3 morning meetings. He handled them. He had handled meetings since before she worked for him, but twice he turned toward the door, once during a budget review, once during a call with his Tokyo legal team. And she wasn't there, and something in the corner of his chest recognized the absence before his brain finished the thought. He didn't name it. He filed it in the category of operational disruption and kept working. The human mind has a tremendous capacity for filing things in the wrong category. He began, and again, not consciously, not with any deliberation, doing small things to extend their working hours together. A revision requested at 6 in the evening that could have waited until morning. A review meeting scheduled for 7 that ran until 8:30, not because the material demanded it, but because he kept generating questions. He told himself he was being thorough. He was often thorough. Thoroughness was how empires stayed standing. Zora noticed. She was an observant person by nature, and she was an expert in Kwon Ji-ho specifically, which made her more observant than usual about anything involving him. She noticed the pattern of the late requests. She noticed the way he sometimes paused before dismissing her from a meeting. A half-second delay, nothing anyone else would catch, but she caught it. She did not say anything, because she was a practical woman and she lived in the real world. And in the real world, a plus-size black woman who is executive secretary to a Korean mafia boss does not walk into his office and say, "I think you're developing feelings for me." You just don't. Not if you value the career you have spent years building. Not if you know what happens to women who mistake professional proximity for personal significance and then have to quietly leave 6 months later with a good reference letter and a story they can never quite tell comfortably at dinner parties. She did not say anything. She filed it in her own wrong category and kept working. Then the gala invitation arrived. Ji-ho attended perhaps a dozen high-profile social functions per year, the kind that required the entire apparatus of his legitimate corporate profile. Charity events, political fundraisers, industry dinners where the guest list was half Fortune 500 and half people whose fortunes were structured to avoid appearing on any list. He typically attended with a rotation of senior staff and appropriate corporate-facing personnel. He told Zora she would accompany him, not in the way you'd ask someone. He told her. The way he told her things when he had already decided they were decided. He put the event details in her calendar and moved on. She said, "Understood," and moved on too. For the 3 days before the gala, she told herself it was a work function, because it was. She told herself she would wear something professional and neutral and appropriate, because she would. Then she stood in her closet the night before and looked at the emerald dress that she had bought 6 months ago for a friend's wedding. A dress that was not professional, not neutral, not designed to disappear. And she understood she was at one of those moments that doesn't announce itself as significant, but is. She had spent 3 years dressing to reduce herself. Not dramatically, not in sackcloth, just strategically. The cuts that minimized, the colors that receded, the silhouettes that said functional, not visible. Because visible in that environment was complicated for a woman who looked like her, and complicated had costs she had been carefully avoiding. She stood in her closet for a long time. She wore the emerald dress. The Haneul Imperial Hotel ballroom was the kind of room that had a specific effect on people who entered it. It was designed to. 40-foot ceilings, imported marble, lighting calibrated to make every surface glow like it was important. Zora had been inside it before, for work, in dark slacks and a blazer, invisible by design, carrying folders. This time she walked in wearing green and she was not invisible. She felt it before she could see it. The slight reorganization of the room's attention, that collective shift that happens when something unexpected enters a space. She kept her expression neutral and her shoulders back and her stride even, which was something she had practiced without ever consciously practicing it, the way you practice the things that keep you from drowning. Ji-ho was 20 feet away when she walked in. She knew because she always knew where he was in a room. Occupational habit, she had told herself for 3 years. His back was to the entrance. I was mid-conversation with a man she recognized as a state senator's chief of staff. He turned before she reached him, turned the way people turn when something pulls their attention before their ears process the reason. And for exactly 3 seconds, Kwon Ji-ho said nothing. That was unusual. Ji-ho always had something to say. Then his expression reassembled into its normal configuration, and he introduced her to the chief of staff, and the evening proceeded. Zora shook hands and spoke when spoken to and managed three separate logistical crises involving seating arrangements and a last-minute speaker substitution, because that was the job, and she did not allow herself to think about those 3 seconds. But the 3 seconds had happened, and the evening was far from over. Adrian Vale found her near the bar an hour into the event. She had met him a handful of times in the office. One of Ji-ho's senior captains, a man with a sharp mind and an easy manner that was somewhat unusual in Ji-ho's circle, where ease was generally performed rather than genuine. He asked her what she was drinking. She told him. He ordered the same and handed it to her and asked whether she'd read anything interesting recently, which was not a question that people typically asked her at these events. And she found herself unexpectedly answering honestly. A biography she'd been working through for 2 weeks. The kind of long, dense, footnoted history that made her feel like her brain was finally getting the exercise it needed. He'd read it. He had actual opinions about it that were not just agreement. They talked for 20 minutes about a book, standing in a ballroom full of people negotiating things worth millions of dollars. And it was the most relaxed Zora had felt in longer than she wanted to calculate. When he suggested they get some air and they moved out to the balcony overlooking the Manhattan skyline, she was aware that it was a gesture with a certain weight. She was also aware that Adrian Vale was a decent man who was asking her onto a balcony because he found her interesting, which was not an experience she had with regularity inside this particular professional universe, and she did not know exactly how she felt about it. She was still working it out when he told her directly, not with artifice, not with layered implication, just plainly, that he would like to take her to dinner. She opened her mouth. And then Ji-ho was there. He had not walked onto the balcony the way he walked into rooms at work, with purpose and forward momentum. He materialized, the way he sometimes did when something had brought him to a point of stillness. He stood just inside the balcony doorway, and he looked at Zora, not at Adrian, and he asked the question in front of both of them. Do you like him? Not excuse me, not Zora, I need you for a moment. Not any of the dozen professional framings that would have preserved the surface of things. Just that question, direct and exposed, in a voice that did not sound like the voice he used when he was in control of himself. Zora felt the ground reorganize under her, because in 3 years she had never heard that voice from him. She had heard his authority voice and his dismissal voice, and the voice he used when he was genuinely angry, quiet, precise, surgical. She had never heard the voice of a man saying something before he decided whether he meant to say it. She looked at him. She looked at Adrian. She thought about the honest answer, which was complicated, and the easy answer, which was a lie, and the truthful but non-committal answer, which was the only one she could construct in the 3 seconds available to her. I don't know. 3 words. Adrian, to his credit, said the exact right thing. He reminded Ji-ho, calmly and with more steadiness than most men would have managed in that moment, that Zora was not a possession and her choices were her own. Ji-ho moved so fast that the sound preceded the comprehension, the crack of Adrian's back hitting the marble, the startled shout of the nearby guard, the gunshot that wasn't a gunshot exactly, but was close enough that the entire ballroom dropped into the particular frozen silence that follows a sound no one is sure they heard correctly. And then the chaos. And at the center of it, Zora Whitfield standing completely still, because she had spent 3 years learning to stand still in the middle of storms that were not hers to solve. And she was standing still now, while she processed the fact that Kwon Ji-ho, a man she had cataloged for 3 years, under professional obligation in the filing system of her heart, had just publicly obliterated his own composure because another man wanted to have dinner with her. She did not know how she felt about that. She was not sure she was ready to find out. The ballroom did not go back to normal. That was the first thing. People tried. The orchestra resumed after approximately 4 minutes of uncertain silence, the conductor making the decision himself, because nobody in authority gave him a signal, and the alternative was just standing there with a bow in his hand while 200 guests stared at each other. Waitstaff circulated with fresh champagne. A cluster of politicians near the East Wall reconstructed their conversation with the practiced speed of people who had survived worse public disruptions and understood that the performance of normalcy was itself a form of power. But the room had changed in the way rooms change after something real happens inside them. The temperature was different. The angles were different. People were talking to each other and watching Ji-ho at the same time, doing both things with the careful split attention of animals monitoring a predator that has behaved unexpectedly. Ji-ho stood at the edge of the ballroom with his jacket still perfectly fitted, his cufflinks still straight, and a tension in his jaw that his senior staff recognized and his political contacts did not. His security detail had reformed around him at the appropriate distance, close enough to respond, far enough to pretend this was still a normal evening. One of them had quietly retrieved the spent shell casing from the marble floor and pocketed it without being asked. Adrian Vale was across the room, standing near the bar, one hand flat on the marble countertop, his breathing still slightly elevated. The impact had caught him across the shoulder blades, and he would feel it for 3 days, but he would not say so to anyone. He accepted a glass of water from a server who had the good instinct not to comment on the situation, and he drank half of it in one motion, his eyes tracking Ji-ho from across the ballroom with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite fear. It was something in between those two things, the specific look of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about his position. Zora was standing where she had been standing when it happened, near the balcony door, and she had not moved because she was still working through the process of deciding what moving meant. Every option had weight. Walking toward Ji-ho meant something. Walking toward Adrian meant something. Walking toward the exit meant something. Standing still meant something too, but it was the only option that didn't commit her to a meaning she hadn't chosen yet. She chose standing still for another 40 seconds. Then she walked to the far side of the room, found a quiet alcove near the coat check, and stood there alone for the first time all evening. Her hands were steady. She checked them because she needed to know. Steady. Good. She picked up the glass of water she'd been carrying since the bar and finished it and set it on the tray of a passing server and looked out across the room and did the thing she'd learned to do when situations exceeded the boundaries of her professional categories. She separated the facts from the feelings and dealt with the facts first. Fact. Ji-ho had physically assaulted one of his own captains in a room full of witnesses. Fact. The trigger was a question about her. Fact. The entire Mujin alliance, plus a substantial portion of New York's legitimate power structure, had watched it happen. Fact. She had said, "I don't know," and those 3 words had caused every other fact on this list. She worked through the implications in order, and by the time she was finished, she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. The feeling version of what had happened, she put in the other column. She would deal with that later, in her car, or at home, or at 2 in the morning when it surfaced on its own without asking permission. She had work to do. The rest of the evening was the longest 2 hours of her professional life. She managed 4 separate conversations involving guests who wanted to pretend nothing unusual had occurred, while also very clearly wanting to discuss the thing that had occurred. She rescheduled a meeting that had been calendared for the following morning because Ji-ho's next 48 hours were about to require significant restructuring. She intercepted a state assemblyman who was drifting toward Ji-ho with the particular energy of a man who had decided this moment was an opportunity for a candid conversation, and she redirected him toward the head of Mujin International's Legal Affairs Division with such smooth inevitability that the assemblyman arrived at that conversation believing he had chosen it. She did not look at Ji-ho directly for the rest of the evening. She was aware of him constantly, his position in the room, his direction of movement, who approached him. In the peripheral and instinctive way she was always aware of him, the 3-year habit of tracking him without appearing to. But she did not look at him directly because she did not trust what her face would do. He looked at her. She knew without seeing it. The cars came at midnight. She rode back to the tower in one of the secondary vehicles, not the primary car. Her own call. She simply went to the right vehicle without discussion. And she sat in the back seat next to one of the junior administrative staff who fell asleep within 6 minutes and snored quietly all the way across the bridge. And she stared out the window at the city and let herself feel the thing in the other column for the 22 minutes of the drive. Then they arrived, and she put it away. She was at her desk by 6:15 the following morning. The report started at 8. Not formal reports. Nothing that official happened that fast. But Mujin International was an organization of several hundred people, connected by the specific gravitational field of people who depend on reading the room correctly for their professional survival, and rooms that experienced a seismic event generally produced aftershocks in the form of conversation. By 8 o'clock, she could feel it in the texture of the morning, the slight delay before people greeted her, the micro-assessment that happened in the 2 seconds before someone decided how to behave around her today. She greeted everyone with the same expression she always wore. Functional, warm, present. She asked about someone's daughter's school performance. She made sure the coffee station was fully stocked. She noted that one of the second-floor conference room projectors had been displaying a warning light for 4 days and filed a maintenance request. At 9:17, the first thing was said to her face. It was one of the other administrative assistants, a woman named Cha Yeon, who had been in Mujin International's executive division for 2 years longer than Zora and had never quite adjusted to Zora's position in the organizational structure. She stopped in the corridor outside Zora's office and said, "You knew what you were doing last night," with the particular tone of someone who has decided to deliver a verdict rather than have a conversation. Zora looked at her. "I was doing my job." "You wore that dress." "Yes." "You knew what would happen." Zora kept her voice level. "What happened was Ji-ho's choice, not mine. And what Adrian did was also his own choice. I didn't manufacture either of them." "You've been managing him for 3 years. Cheon's voice had gone quiet in the way voices go quiet when they want to cut without being overheard. "Everyone sees it. The late nights, the extra access, the way he looks at you." "The way he looks at me is because I do the job. There are other people who do the job. None of them are still here." That landed wrong. She heard it as soon as it left her mouth, not because it was untrue, but because it had an edge that she hadn't intended to let out. Cheon's expression shifted into something that was close to satisfaction, like she had successfully provoked the response she was looking for. "Right," Cheon said. And isn't that interesting?" She walked away. Zora stood in the corridor for a moment, then she went back to her desk and pulled up Ji-ho's calendar for the week, and began the process of managing the damage from the previous night, which was her job, and which gave her somewhere to put the anger so it didn't just sit in her chest getting bigger. Ji-ho arrived at 9:45, later than his usual time, which was not entirely unusual after late events, but his face carried the specific quality of a man who had slept less than he needed and decided not to acknowledge it. He walked past her desk toward his office, then stopped without turning around. "Clear the morning after 11. "It's already cleared," she said. A pause. "How far ahead did you clear it?" "Yesterday? Before the gala." He turned around then. He looked at her, the direct evaluating look that he reserved for situations he was reassessing. And then he looked at her face specifically, which he didn't always do, which she noticed because she noticed everything about him. "Come in at 11, he said. "Yes." He went into his office. She did not. For the next hour and 40 minutes, she answered 12 emails, confirmed 3 amended meeting times, handled a minor crisis involving a contract renewal with a technology vendor, and did not think about the 11 o'clock meeting, except constantly. At 11, she knocked twice on his office door, entered, and closed it behind her. He was standing at the window, which he did sometimes when he was working through something that required more physical space than his desk allowed. He did not turn around immediately. She sat in the chair across from his desk and waited. "Last night was," he started and then stopped. She waited. He turned around. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, the kind of tired that comes from the gap between the person you believe yourself to be and the person you just watched yourself be in a public room. "It should not have happened," he said. "No," she agreed. "Adrian acted with respect," she said. "What he did was appropriate. What you did wasn't." The words came out steady, which she was grateful for because the steadiness had required something from her to maintain. Ji-ho was not a man people corrected. She was aware of that. She also was not a person who could sit in this office and absorb a partial non-apology and call it resolution. He did not react the way she had halfway braced for no contraction, no dominance reflex. He just looked at her. "Yes," he said, "what I did wasn't." The admission was so unadorned that it took her a moment to register it. Ji-ho did not say yes. I was wrong in the way she'd heard him say it just now. He said this was incorrect or this approach was insufficient. He used passive constructions and strategic framing. He did not just stand at his window and say yes in that particular voice. She looked at her hands, looked back up. "I need to understand what that was," she said, "not to make it difficult, because I can't keep doing this job if the foundation of it just shifted and I don't know what the foundation is anymore." He was quiet for long enough that she heard the heating system cycling on in the ventilation above them. "I don't have a clean answer," he said. "That's not..." He stopped again. Started over. I am not a person who doesn't have clean answers. I find that I don't have one. It was the most honest thing she had ever heard him say. She nodded once. Okay. That's all you... I need time to think, she said. You do too. We don't have to resolve this morning. She stood up. She smoothed the front of her jacket. Your soul call is at 1. The documentation for the harbor contract is on your desk. The Yoon dinner on Thursday has a table conflict that I've already forwarded to the venue. She walked out. She had her hand on the door when he said, Zora. She stopped. Didn't turn around. I'm sorry about last night. She stood with her hand on the door for a moment. Then she nodded, not so that he could see it, and walked out and closed the door and sat at her desk and did not permit her expression to change for the remainder of the morning. The afternoon was where things started to deteriorate. Sarah Han arrived at 3:45 with the specific energy of a woman who has made a social decision and arrived to execute it. Zora had met Sarah Han perhaps 6 times at industry events, twice at the tower, and she understood her position in Ji-ho's world without needing it explained. Sarah was the daughter of Assemblyman Han, one of Ji-ho's most valuable political connections, and she moved through Mujin International's social orbit with the comfortable assurance of a woman who had been told from birth that rooms were built for her arrival. She was beautiful in the way that required significant infrastructure, the kind of beauty that had a team behind it and knew how to present itself. She sat down across from Zora's desk without being invited, crossed her legs, and looked at Zora with an expression that was performing warmth over top of something considerably cooler. I heard about last night, Sarah said. Most people have, Zora said. Are you all right? I'm fine, thank you. Sarah tilted her head slightly. It must have been uncomfortable, being at the center of something like that. I've handled uncomfortable situations before. I'm sure you have. The warmth in Sarah's expression thinned slightly. I just think, and I say this with genuine concern, that some situations are uncomfortable because they've been engineered to be. Wouldn't you agree? Zora placed her pen on her desk. What are you suggesting, Ms. Han? I'm suggesting that a very smart woman, working in a very competitive environment, might understand that visible loyalty, performed in the right settings, calibrated just right, can move a career in directions that raw competence alone might not. Sarah smiled. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just worth being honest about. The room was quiet enough that Zora could hear the air conditioning. She looked at Sarah Han and she thought about what she wanted to say, which was sharp and accurate and would have ended the conversation with clarity, and she thought about what it would cost her to say it, and she set it aside. I appreciate your concern, Zora said. Ji-ho's 2 o'clock prep materials are on their way to his desk, and I'm in the middle of coordinating the Thursday venue situation. Was there something specific I could help you with today? Sarah held her gaze for a moment. Then she stood, smooth and unhurried. He'll marry well, Sarah said, almost as an aside. Men like Ji-ho always do. The families expect it. The alliances require it. Whatever else is happening, she let that breathe. It doesn't change the structural realities. She left. Zora sat at her desk. She picked up her pen. She set it back down. The structural realities. That was the thing Sarah had said that landed the deepest, because it wasn't wrong. It was the thing Zora had kept in her second column for 3 years. The part she didn't examine because examining it required admitting what she would find when she looked directly at it. Ji-ho existed inside a world of arranged political alliances, family obligations, and organizational expectations that had nothing to do with what he wanted in any particular quiet moment. Whatever the 11 o'clock meeting had contained, whatever his voice had sounded like when he said, I don't know, whatever 3 seconds had existed when he turned and looked at her in green, none of that existed inside the structural realities that governed his life. She knew this. She had always known this. She had kept it in the second column because knowing it and feeling it in the same column at the same time was the kind of thing that made it impossible to come to work on a Tuesday morning and function. She began drafting her resignation letter at 9:17 that evening, at her kitchen table, with a glass of wine she didn't finish. She wrote 5 drafts. The first was too long. The second was too cold. The third had a sentence she deleted because it said too much about something she hadn't decided she was allowed to feel. The fourth was close. The fifth was right. Professional, warm, 2 weeks' notice, No explanation offered beyond to pursue other professional opportunities. The standard language that meant nothing and communicated everything. She printed it. She put it in her work bag. She washed her glass, dried it, put it away. She lay in the dark for a long time. In the morning, she went to work and put the letter on Ji-ho's desk and sat in the chair across from him and said the things she had decided to say, that she would not have her professional reputation become a liability to the organization or to him, that the clarity of her role had been compromised in a way that was professionally untenable, that she had too much respect for the work they had done together to let it erode under the weight of something neither of them had named correctly. She said it clearly, without crying, which cost her more than she would ever tell anyone. Ji-ho sat at his desk and looked at the letter and said nothing. She watched something happen in his face that she did not have a category for. Not anger, not calculation. Something that preceded both of those, something earlier and rawer that she had never seen there before. "You're leaving," he said. "I'm giving appropriate notice and ensuring a full transition. You're leaving." The repetition was different from the first time. Less statement, more something else. "I think it's the right decision," she said, "for the organization, for both of us." Ji-ho looked at the letter. He looked at it the way you look at something that you can see is about to be permanent. "The filing discrepancy," he said, "the warehouse security schedule, the union negotiation." She stilled. Those were not things she expected him to name. Those were things she had handled quietly, without discussion, folded into the fabric of her work so seamlessly that she had assumed they existed in the category of things he had noted and filed but never thought about directly. "I know about all of it," he said. "I always knew." "Then you know the transition won't—" "That's not what I'm saying." His voice had gone quiet in a way that was different from his dangerous quiet. It was a different register entirely. "I'm saying that I know what you've done. For 3 years, I know what I have received from you. And I am looking at a letter that says you intend to leave, and I am finding that I—" He stopped. She waited. His jaw tightened. He pushed the letter back across the desk toward her. "I won't accept it." "Ji-ho, I am telling you." The authority was back, the surface layer of it, but underneath it was something exposed and unsteady, like a structural wall with the plaster stripped off. "I am not accepting this letter." She looked at him for a long time. She thought about Sarahan and structural realities. She thought about the 3 seconds when he turned and looked at her. She thought about the 11 o'clock meeting and the rawness she had heard in his voice. She thought about the fact that right now, in his office, with a resignation letter between them, she still didn't know what any of it meant, what he meant, what she was allowed to mean, what the space between them actually was or could become without destroying both of them. She reached across the desk. She took the letter back. "I'm keeping it," she said quietly. "Whether you accept it is a separate question." She stood. He didn't tell her to stay. She had expected him to, and he didn't. He just watched her stand up with that stripped wall look still on his face, and that was somehow harder to walk away from than any order would have been. She walked out of his office. She sat at her desk. She put the letter in the top left drawer and closed it and pulled up the Thursday venue logistics and started working, because that was the only thing available to her that made sense. 2 hours later, Cheon stopped in the corridor again. This time she wasn't alone. There were 2 of the other assistants with her and a junior accounts manager named Park, who had the specific quality of a man who had decided which side of a situation was safer and positioned himself accordingly. Cheon looked at Zora's desk with an expression that had moved past the morning's quiet cruelty into something more deliberate. "Everyone's talking," Cheon said, "about why a woman with no family connections, no background in this industry, and no real qualifications beyond administrative work has access to the things you have access to." She kept her voice conversational, which was the part that made it worst. "People have questions, reasonable questions." "People can have questions," Zora said. "That's their right. It's just that nobody can quite explain it. The access, the trust, the fact that he—" Cheon paused, let the pause do the work. "Reacted, the way he did, last night. I can't explain other people's reactions." "Can't you?" Park cleared his throat softly, not quite participating, not quite pulling back. Zora looked at each of them in turn. Not with anger. She had learned a long time ago that anger was the response they were looking for, the thing that would confirm their narrative. She looked at them the way you look at something you are choosing to file rather than engage with. I have work to do, she said. If you need something from this office, I'm happy to help. They left. She sat at her desk and she thought, this is what it costs. Not the work, not the long hours, not the 3 minutes in the parking structure. This, the moment when everything she had built was being retroactively reframed as something she had obtained through a mechanism that required no skill, no discipline, no sacrifice, just the willingness to position herself correctly near a powerful man. She had known this could happen. She had been careful for 3 years precisely to prevent it from happening. She had dressed to disappear. She had not sought visibility. She had let her work speak and kept her person quiet, and done everything that a person in her position who understood the landscape does to preemptively close the doors that other people open for the purposes of walking through them uninvited. And it had happened anyway, because the one thing she could not have controlled was him. The resignation letter stayed in the top left drawer through the rest of that day and the day that followed. On the third day, she opened the drawer in the morning and looked at it, and she thought about Sarahan's voice saying structural realities, and she thought about Ji-ho's voice saying, I won't accept it, and she thought about 3 seconds in a ballroom when he turned and had nothing to say. She took the letter out. She smoothed it flat on her desk. She thought about the 17 people in this building who had looked at her differently in the last 72 hours. She thought about Chaeyeon's voice doing the math on her qualifications. She thought about what it meant to stay, not just for the next 2 weeks, but after, in a landscape that had fundamentally changed around her without her consent. She thought about the fact that she had not come this far to be retroactively defined by someone else's narrative. She had not spent 3 years doing the work she had done to have its legitimacy stripped from her by a man losing control in a marble ballroom. She put the letter in her bag. She walked down the hall to Ji-ho's office. She knocked, opened the door. He was at his desk, phone to his ear, and he looked up when she entered with the particular sharpened attention he gave her that he did not give other people, and she put the letter on his desk in front of him. He looked at it. I'm placing this formally, she said. 2 weeks' notice. Full transition documentation. I will ensure whoever takes this position has everything they need. His jaw tightened. He said into the phone, I'll call you back, and set it down. Zora, what happened in that ballroom followed me into this building, she said. It's in the corridors. It's at my desk. It is in the way people look at me now, and the things they say, and the questions they're asking about how I earned what I earned. She kept her voice even. She had worked on the evenness since 5:30 that morning. I will not let it erase 3 years of work, and I will not let staying here in these conditions be the thing that erases it for me. She watched something move across his face. The rawness again, but deeper this time. The stripped wall quality cracked through to something underneath it that she could not name and did not allow herself to look at too directly. You said you needed time to think, he said. I've thought. One conversation. It's not about one conversation. She folded her hands in front of her. It's about the fact that I do not know what this is, what you meant, what I mean to you, what any of last week was. And I cannot live inside that uncertainty while the entire organization decides my professional worth was constructed around it. Her voice held. She was proud of that. I need to go, so that when I am somewhere else, what I built here belongs to me, undeniably. The silence lasted long enough that she heard the ventilation again. Then Ji-ho stood up. He didn't come around the desk. He just stood, and for the first time in 3 years, Kwon Ji-ho, who occupied every room he entered with the absolute density of a man who had never once questioned his right to be its center, looked like a man standing on uncertain ground, not knowing which direction the floor would hold. Don't go, he said. 2 words. No command behind them. No authority. Just 2 words in the voice she had heard once before, in the morning after, when he had said, I'm sorry, and she had nodded without turning around. She held his gaze. She picked up the letter. She turned around and walked to the door and opened it and left his office. And her hands were steady. She checked them. They were steady. And she walked back to her desk and sat down and stared at her screen and understood that she had just passed the point past which she could not go back. That the letter in her bag was no longer a possibility but a fact. And the fact was now load-bearing. And the structure of everything that came after was going to have to be built on top of it, whatever that looked like, whatever it cost. She opened her email. She began drafting the transition documentation. She did not permit herself to think about his face. The transition documentation took 4 days to build correctly. Zora did not rush it. Rushing would have been the easier thing. Pack it together, hand it over, leave before the weight of the building had time to press down further. But rushing was not how she operated, and she was not about to let the circumstances of her exit change the standards of her work. She built the documentation the way she had built everything in this office, methodically, completely, with the kind of detail that anticipated questions before they were asked. She created folder structures. She wrote process notes in plain language, not the condensed shorthand she normally used because she normally expected to be the one reading them. She documented the vendor relationships she had cultivated, the communication preferences of Ji-ho's 30 most critical contacts, the unwritten protocols that governed how certain calls were routed and how certain requests were categorized. She wrote the things that had never been written down because she had been the institutional memory, and institutional memory, when it walks out the door, should leave something behind. She did this between 8 in the morning and 7 in the evening for 4 consecutive days, and she did it with the same face she wore every day, and nobody looking at her desk from the corridor would have known that anything had changed. Ji-ho did not call her into his office. He did not send messages through the internal system. He came in each morning, and he worked, and he left in the evening, and he passed her desk twice a day. Once in, once out. And each time he stopped for exactly long enough to confirm that she was there. And then he kept moving, and she kept working, and neither of them said anything that was not logistically necessary. This was, in its way, worse than a confrontation. On the 4th day, she delivered the completed documentation package to his desk at 3 in the afternoon. It was bound, indexed, a separate summary sheet on top outlining the structure so that whoever came next could navigate it without her assistance. She placed it on the left side of his desk, the side she had always used for materials that required his attention, and she turned to leave. "Zora." She stopped. "Sit down." She turned around. She sat in the chair across from his desk. She folded her hands. Ji-ho looked at the documentation package. He did not open it. He put one hand flat on top of it, the way you put your hand on something when you're not ready to deal with what's inside, but you need to acknowledge that it exists. "I convened a leadership meeting this morning," he said. She hadn't known about a leadership meeting. That was unusual. She scheduled everything, and the fact that this had happened without her suggested it had been assembled quickly and deliberately off her calendar. "I asked them to tell me things you had done that I didn't know about," he said. She said nothing. It ran nearly an hour. She stayed still. "The warehouse," he said. "The Yoon negotiation. I knew the broad strokes, but not that you rearranged the meeting sequence to prevent the Park faction from triangulating. The contract discrepancy I knew. The 4 other compliance flags you caught in 18 months that I never saw because you resolved them before they reached my desk. I didn't know about those. They were resolved. They were resolved because you resolved them. That's different from them not existing." She looked at the documentation package under his hand. She thought about what it meant that he was saying this now, 4 days after she had placed the letter on his desk, and she thought about what it would cost her to feel grateful for it. "Ji-young in accounting," he said. Ji-young was one of the junior financial analysts, 24 years old, 8 months in, had made a significant input error in a quarterly model that, if it had been escalated, would have ended her position. You caught it and corrected it without involving her supervisor. She would have caught it herself within a day. That's not the point. Then what is the point? Her voice came out with more edge than she intended. She pulled it back. "I'm sorry. What I mean is, I did what made sense. In each instance, that's the job. That's more than the job." She looked at him directly. "With respect, Ji-ho, if you called me in here to tell me I've been good at my work, I've known that for 3 years. I don't need the audit to confirm it. And if this is an attempt to—" She stopped herself, recalibrated. "I'm not sure what outcome you're looking for from this conversation." He was quiet for a moment. "Adrian told me something," Ji-ho said. She waited. "He said you see people that everyone else thinks are invisible." He said it without inflection, reporting it, like he was still working out what to do with the information. He meant the junior staff, the security officers, the people whose names nobody in my senior leadership knows. Someone has to. You sent meals to Sergeant Bak's team when 3 of them were injured in the Incheon situation. You remembered the name of Officer Choi's youngest daughter and sent her a gift when she started school. I have a good memory. You paid for intern Ha's emergency flight when his father was hospitalized. Out of your own pocket. She said nothing. He paid you back, Ji-ho said. I know because I asked him. He said you refused 3 times and he had to wire it to your account without asking. A pause. You didn't expense it. You didn't mention it. You just did it. It was the right thing to do. Yes. He looked at his hands. That's what I mean. He looked back up. I built this organization on the understanding that loyalty is a transaction, that people stay because leaving is worse. I have spent 20 years being very effective at ensuring that leaving is worse. His voice had the quality of someone reading aloud something they had written privately and were not entirely comfortable saying out loud. And in that same organization, for 3 years, there has been a person who understands loyalty as something else entirely, who performs it without being asked, who extends it to people who cannot offer anything in return. He paused. I didn't understand that I was watching something I'd never actually seen before. The room was quiet. Zora looked at her hands. She looked at the documentation package. She thought about 17 different things in rapid succession, and she selected the one that was truest. This doesn't change what I said, she told him, about leaving. I know. Then why? Because I needed you to know that I see it. His voice had gone to that register again, the one she didn't have a category for. Not because it changes your decision, because you have spent 3 years doing work that deserved to be seen, and I was looking without understanding what I was looking at, and that is a failure I am accountable for. She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood. The documentation package covers everything through end of next week, she said. I'll be available by phone for 30 days after my last date for transition questions. She walked to the door. The leadership meeting, Ji-ho said. It isn't over. She paused with her hand on the door frame. What does that mean? It means there's more, he said. Things I found that I haven't finished understanding yet. Things that don't make sense yet. She stood in the door frame. She had the particular feeling of a person who understands that something is coming and cannot yet calculate its shape or direction. I'll be at my desk, she said, and went back to it. She found out what he meant the following morning. She arrived at 6:45 earlier than usual because sleep had not been working and the office was better than lying in the dark accounting for things she could not change. She made coffee. She opened her computer. She began working through the last items on her transition list. At 7:12, Ji-ho's primary security chief, a man named Director Kang, who had the build of a former military officer and the affect of someone who had learned to remove all readable emotion from his face as a professional practice, appeared at her office door. He was not someone who appeared at her office door. Ms. Whitfield. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, which was also not something he did. I need to ask you some questions. On behalf of a review Mr. Kwon has initiated. She set her coffee down. What kind of review? A security review? He sat without being invited, which told her the conversation had already been structured, and her invitation was not part of the structure, specifically regarding access and information flow over the past 14 months. Something moved in the back of her awareness. Not panic. She was too careful for panic to be her first response. Something cooler, more precise. The calculation beginning. What specifically? Director Kang placed a tablet on her desk. On the screen was a document, an internal communication, formatted with Mujin International's standard header. She leaned forward to read it. It was a routing memo. Her name on the distribution, 14 months ago. She read it twice. I never received this, she said. Your signature is on the confirmation receipt. I didn't sign. She stopped, looked more carefully. The signature was correct. Format, spacing, the slight left tilt she used. But the date was wrong. Not obviously wrong. A single digit. A 1 transposed to a 7. The kind of error that was invisible unless you were looking for it. Where did this come from? She said. It came from your outbox, Director Kang said. Server records. Pull the original metadata, she said immediately. Timestamp, IP address, machine ID. If that came from my outbox, pull the full server log, not the document header. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was deciding whether she was being evasive or professional. She held his gaze and did not help him decide. There are 4 documents, he said. This is the first. She sat back in her chair. 4 documents. The calculation was running fast now. building the shape of what this was from the perimeter in, the way you build a picture when you can't see the center yet. "Show me all four," she said. He showed her. 2 routing memos. 1 internal security briefing. Not the briefing itself, but a confirmation that she had received and acknowledged it 14 months ago, 3 weeks before a logistics operation in the harbor district that had developed complications. 1 email, sent from her address to an external address she had never seen before, containing a single line of text that read, "Thursday confirmed," dated the day before the harbor complications. She looked at all 4 documents for a long time. "I need to speak to Ji-ho directly," she said. "Mr. Kwon has asked that—" "I understand what Mr. Kwon has asked. I am asking you to tell him that I need to speak to him directly because what you are showing me constitutes a deliberate fabrication, and I am not going to sit across from his security director and address a fabrication as though it were a legitimate inquiry." She kept her voice completely level. "That is not disrespect for this process. That is the correct process." Director Kong looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his phone. Ji-ho appeared in her office 11 minutes later. He came alone, which surprised her. He looked at her, and then at Director Kang, and then at the tablet on her desk. "Leave us," he said. Director Kong left without a word, pulling the door mostly closed. Ji-ho sat in the chair Director Kong had vacated. He looked at the tablet. "Tell me," he said. "These documents are manufactured," she said. "I didn't receive the routing memos, and I didn't send that email. The signature on the confirmation is close, but the metadata will show you the machine ID doesn't match any terminal I've used. The external email address. I've never seen it. Run it against any device on my network profile and you will find nothing." She kept her voice steady and clear and fast, because the fastest route through this was precision. "Someone built this. Recently. The documents are correctly formatted, but they don't exist in my memory of 14 months ago, and I have an excellent memory." Ji-ho looked at the tablet. He looked at her. "Why would someone build this?" he said. Not quite a question. "Because I handed in a resignation," she said, "and because the last 2 weeks have made my name visible in this organization in a way it wasn't before. And because someone in this building has a reason to want my departure to look like cause rather than choice." The words sat between them. She watched Ji-ho's face. Not for approval. She was past that. But because his face was the only reliable indicator of what the next 10 minutes would look like. And she needed to know what the next 10 minutes would look like. His expression was doing something she recognized from the documentation package, the analytical processing, the building of a structure from available data. But underneath it was something she had seen more recently. In the morning after the ballroom. In his office with her letter on his desk. "I believe you," he said. The tension in her shoulders dropped approximately 1 centimeter. She did not let it drop further. "Then pull the metadata," she said. "Now, before anyone has additional time to work on the supporting architecture." He pulled out his phone and made a call. 3 words. The call lasted 9 seconds. Then he set the phone down and looked at her. "While we wait," he said, "walk me through the harbor operation 14 months ago. What you knew, what you were told, what you observed." She walked him through it, methodically. She had a good memory, and she used it. Meeting dates, document references, personnel involved, decisions she had been party to, and decisions that had gone above her access level. She spoke for 11 minutes, and he listened without interrupting, which was the Ji-ho she knew, the one who gathered before he responded, who understood that the most valuable thing you could do with information was receive it completely before processing it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The complications in the harbor operation," he said slowly, "cost us significantly. 3 contracts, 2 political relationships, and 1 asset we have not been able to replace." "I know," she said. "The investigation at the time concluded the intelligence failure was internal, that someone with access to the operational schedule had communicated timing to a competing interest." He paused. "The investigation did not identify a source." She looked at him. "These documents," he said, "would place you in that access chain." "Yes," she said. "I understand what they would do. Someone wants the current investigation to conclude that I was the source 14 months ago," she said, "and that my resignation is an attempt to exit before the connection is made." She kept her voice even. "Which means whoever built this has been patient. They built the architecture 14 months ago, or they backdated it well enough that the metadata will be difficult. They waited for a moment when my name would already be in a negative frame. And they moved now. Ji-ho stood up. He walked to the window he used when he was processing something that required physical space, and stood with his back to her. She watched his shoulders. The call came back 18 minutes later. Director Kong knocked and entered and read from his own phone in a voice that had lost the careful neutrality it started with. The machine ID on the routing confirmations matched a terminal in the executive administrative pool, not Zora's assigned terminal. A shared pool terminal on the third floor used by rotating administrative staff. The IP address on the external email did not match any device registered to Zora's network profile. The metadata timestamp on all 4 documents showed a creation date of 9 days ago. 9 days ago, not 14 months ago. And the modification history showed 2 editing sessions within a 6-hour window. 9 days ago was 4 days after the gala. 4 days after Zora's name had become the name everyone in the building was talking about. Director Kong stopped reading. The room was quiet enough that she could hear the ventilation and the distant sound of the elevator somewhere down the hall. Ji-ho turned from the window. He did not look at Director Kong. He looked at Zora. "Find out who used that terminal," he said to Kong, "in the 72 hours before those documents were created. Full access log, badge records, camera footage, the sequence in which files were opened and closed. All of it." "Yes, sir." "And Kong." Ji-ho's voice had shifted. It was the quiet voice, not the raw one, not the authority one, but the specific quiet that the people who had worked for him longest understood meant the processing was done, and what came next was not processing. Do this with 2 people, not the full security division, 2 people you trust completely, and nobody else knows the scope of what you're looking for. Kong left. Ji-ho turned back to Zora. "I'm sorry," he said, "for this morning, for the process. You had to follow the information you were given. I should have come to you first." "Yes." She said it without softening it. "You should have." He took it. He nodded once. She looked at her desk. She looked at the transition documentation package sitting on the side table where she'd moved it when Kang had first appeared. She thought about everything that had just happened, the shape of it, the architecture of it, the specific and deliberate cruelty of building something 9 days ago, and placing her name at the center of a 14-month-old failure. "Someone in this building," she said carefully, "has been watching this closely enough to know exactly when to move. They knew about my resignation. They knew about the investigation's unresolved source question. They knew which terminal to use and how to format the documents and how to time the submission." "Yes," Ji-ho said. "That person has access," she said. "Senior access, or access to someone with senior access." "Yes." She looked at him. He looked at her. The thing that neither of them said out loud was that the set of people with that level of access and that level of motivation was not large. The thing that neither of them said was that the timing, 9 days ago, 4 days after the gala, after the whole building started talking, suggested someone who had been watching the situation between Ji-ho and Zora with enough proximity to understand that a public incident had created a window. The thing that neither of them said was Sarahan's name, but it was in the room. The results came back to Director Kong at 4:17 that afternoon. He brought them to Ji-ho's office. Zora was still there. Ji-ho had asked her to stay, which she had done because leaving felt wrong, and because she needed to know the shape of what was coming. She sat on the far side of the room while Kong delivered the report, because she was still technically a person under review until the investigation formally cleared her, and she understood the importance of correct positioning in a room where authority was being exercised. The terminal access log showed 3 separate logins in the 48 hours before the documents were created. 2 were routine administrative users, both verified and cleared within the hour. The third login used a badge that belonged to a member of the executive administrative pool named Mina Cho, who had been out sick on both of the days the log showed her badge being used. Mina Cho had not used her badge. Someone had used it for her. The camera footage from the third-floor corridor showed the terminal being accessed by a figure in service staff clothing, the kind of clothing that moved invisibly through every floor of the building because it was designed to. The figure's face was angled away from the camera at each point, with the practiced consistency of someone who knew exactly where the cameras were, someone who knew the building's camera positions. That was not public information. Ji-ho sat at his desk and looked at the report, and his jaw was set in a way that Zora recognized from the moments before things in his organization became irrevocable. "The camera angle," she said from across the room. "In the executive wing, the south corridor has a 3-second blind spot at the turn near the fire door. It's in the maintenance report from 2 years ago. I know about it because I flagged it as a vulnerability and requested a supplemental camera." She paused. "The request was approved, but the installation was delayed. I have the correspondence." Both men looked at her. "The figure on the footage," she said. "Do they use the blind spot?" Kong checked the footage log on his tablet. He looked up. "Yes," he said. "They enter the blind spot at the turn, and the next camera picks them up at the elevator. The time gap is consistent with using the stairs." "The supplemental camera," she said. "Was it ever installed?" Kong checked. "Installed 14 months ago," he said. 6 weeks after your request. "Pull that camera's footage for the same window," Kong typed. He waited. He looked at his screen. He turned the tablet around. The supplemental camera was positioned on the stairwell side of the fire door. It showed the figure removing the service staff jacket on the landing between the 3rd and 4th floor, folding it, placing it in a bag, and continuing up the stairs in the clothing underneath. The clothing underneath was not service staff uniform. The figure emerged on the 4th floor, the executive floor, and walked past the camera with their face turned away. But the camera angle, supplemental and positioned slightly differently than the building's standard grid, caught a 3/4 profile. It was enough. Kong set the tablet down on Ji-ho's desk without speaking. Ji-ho looked at the image. He looked at it for a long time. Zora stayed on her side of the room, and she did not ask to see the image because she understood that she was not the person who needed to see it first. She waited. When Ji-ho looked up from the tablet, his face had the quality of marble. Not cold exactly, but dense, set, the kind of face that meant something had been decided. "Get me a conference room," he said to Kong. "East wing, the secure one. No advance notice to anyone on the executive floor." "Yes, sir." "And Kang." Ji-ho picked up the tablet and held it for a moment. "Make sure the footage is duplicated and stored off-site before you schedule anything." Kong nodded and left. Zora and Ji-ho were alone in the office. She sat with her hands folded and waited for him to tell her. He turned the tablet toward her. She looked at the image for 3 seconds. She had been braced for several possibilities. She had, in the abstract, named Sarah Han in the privacy of her own mind. Sarah had access, not to the building systems directly, but through her father's political relationship with Ji-ho, through the years of gala attendance and boardroom adjacency and the specific social infrastructure that allowed certain people to know certain things without formal credentials. But the face in the camera was not Sarah Han. It was Cheon. Zora sat with that for a moment, the pieces rearranging. Cheon, who had been in Mujin International longer than Zora. Cheon, who knew the building's camera grid because she had worked on the floor long enough to absorb it. Cheon, who had the administrative access to understand how documents were formatted and how the system's confirmation receipts functioned. Cheon, who had stood in the corridor 5 days ago and said you knew what you were doing with the confidence of a woman who had already decided on an outcome and was simply watching it arrive. "She would have needed help," Zora said quietly. "She doesn't have access to the harbor operations investigation files. Those are senior security clearance. She couldn't have known the unresolved source question without someone telling her." Ji-ho looked at her. "Someone fed her the information," Zora said, "gave her the file gap, explained what to build and where to put it." She looked at the image again. "She's not the architect. She's the hand." Ji-ho stood. He walked to the window again and stood there for a long time, and Zora watched his reflection in the glass, the face that had gone to marble, the shoulders that were carrying something that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with the specific horror of understanding that someone inside your own architecture had been weaponized against a person you had failed to protect. "The conference room," he said mostly to himself. "Ji-ho." He turned. "Before you go into that conference room," she said, "I need you to hear something." He waited. "Whoever gave Cheon that information did it because they understood that the most effective way to remove me was not to attack me directly." She kept her voice flat and factual, the way she kept it when things were most important. "A direct attack would have required public confrontation, evidence, the kind of process that creates visibility." She paused. What they built instead was a quiet process, an internal security review, the kind that ends with a person resigning or being asked to resign, under a cloud that never quite resolves. No public confrontation, no visibility, just a question mark that follows someone's name. Ji-ho looked at her. They understood your organization, she said. They understood how a review would function and how you would respond to it and what the optics would require. She held his gaze. That's not Cheon. Cheon knows where the cameras are. She doesn't know how you think. The room was so quiet she could hear her own pulse. Ji-ho looked at her for a long time. Then he said quietly and with the flat certainty of a man who has stopped processing and arrived at a conclusion, Han. Not Sarah Han. Just the surname, the family name, the alliance name. The name that was connected to a state assemblyman, a decade of political infrastructure, and a woman who had sat across Zora's desk 5 days ago and said structural realities in a voice like she was reading from a document she had already written. Zora said nothing. She didn't need to. Ji-ho picked up his phone. He made 2 calls. The first lasted 40 seconds. The second lasted 3 minutes, and his voice during the second call was the quiet voice, the irrevocable one. And she caught 4 words in the middle of it that she would think about for the rest of that evening. Not yet, but completely. He hung up. He turned toward the door. Then he stopped and looked back at her, and his face had the quality of a man who has just understood something about the landscape he is standing in that changes the scale of everything around him. Your resignation, he said. She looked at him. When I walk into that conference room, he said, what happens next is going to require every structural relationship this organization has. Political, legal, operational. A pause. I need to know whether the person who built this documentation system, who caught the compliance flags, who prevented the U negotiation from collapsing, whether she is still in this building or whether she is in the process of leaving it. She looked at him. It was not a small question. She understood exactly what he was asking and exactly what it was not asking, because the thing it was not asking was the thing she still did not have an answer to. The green dress, the 3 seconds, the stripped wall voice saying, don't go. That question was still in its column, still unresolved, still carrying the weight of everything Sarah Han had said about structural realities. But this question, the question of the organization, the investigation, the architecture that someone had tried to use to erase her. This question she could answer. She looked at her transition documentation package sitting on the side table. She looked at Ji-ho. I'm still in this building, she said. He held her gaze for one moment. Then he turned and walked out the door, and his footsteps down the corridor had the particular rhythm of a man who has arrived at the point past which the only available direction is forward, and everything that had existed before this afternoon was now behind him. Zora sat alone in his office. She looked at the documentation package. She looked at the tablet still open on his desk, the image still visible, Cheon's face in 3/4 profile, caught by a camera that existed because Zora had flagged a vulnerability 2 years ago and followed it through the approval process, and tracked the installation date in a spreadsheet that nobody had asked her to keep. She thought about that. She thought about the fact that the camera that caught the person trying to destroy her was a camera she had put there herself, built from a vulnerability she had noticed when no one else was looking, resolved through a process she had completed without being asked. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she stood, picked up the documentation package, carried it to the side table, and placed it face down so the cover was not visible. Not yet. She went back to her desk. She opened her computer, and she began to work. The conference room in the East Wing had no windows. That was by design. Ji-ho had specified it when the floor was renovated 4 years ago. A room where the outside world did not exist, where the only reality was the table and the people around it, and whatever truth was being constructed or dismantled within its walls. The soundproofing was complete. The ventilation was independent. The single camera mounted in the upper corner fed to a system that only Director Kang and Ji-ho could access, and the footage was stored in a location that was not on Mujin International's standard server architecture. Ji-ho sat at the head of the table at 5:40 in the afternoon. Cheon sat at the far end, and she had the look of a woman who had walked into a room expecting one kind of conversation and understood within the first 10 seconds of sitting down that she was in a significantly different kind. Her hands were on the table in front of her, flat, which was either composure or the performance of composure, and the difference between those two things would become apparent shortly. Director Kang stood to Ji-ho's right. One of Kang's two selected people stood near the door. Ji-ho did not begin immediately. He let the silence run for nearly a full minute, which was something he did in rooms like this because silence cost him nothing and cost everyone else something different depending on what they were carrying. Chaeyeon's left thumb moved twice against the table surface. Small movement. She caught it and stopped. The third-floor terminal, Ji-ho said. Administrative pool. Tell me when you last used it. Chaeyeon's expression did not change dramatically. It recalibrated. A slight tightening around the eyes. A fraction of a second where the machinery of response was visible before the response itself appeared. I use it occasionally. When my workstation has the dates, Ji-ho said, specifically. I don't remember specific dates for every... Kang. Kang placed the access log on the table and slid it to Chaeyeon's end. She looked at it. She did not touch it. 2 entries, Ji-ho said, both on days when your badge record shows you were not in the building. A pause. The machinery visible again, longer this time. I may have come in briefly. Your keycard did not register entry on either day, Ji-ho said, which means someone carried your badge into the building without you. The silence was different now. Chaeyeon's hands were still flat on the table, but her breathing had shifted. Fractionally, the kind of shift that was only visible if you were watching for it, and Ji-ho had been watching for it. I don't know anything about the camera footage, Ji-ho said, is not the question I'm asking. He leaned forward slightly. I'm asking who gave you the harbor operation file. Her chin came up. A reflex. The defensive positioning of someone who has decided that forward is safer than backward. I don't know what you're referring to. The investigation, Ji-ho said, 14 months ago. The unresolved source question. That file has a security classification that requires senior clearance. You don't have senior clearance. He kept his voice completely flat. Someone explained it to you. Someone told you what the gap was and how to use it. I want to know who. Chaeyeon looked at the access log. She looked at Ji-ho. She looked at the door, not longingly, just the instinctive geometry check of a person calculating available exits and finding none of them usable. I think I need... You don't need anything except to answer the question, Ji-ho said. You're not under arrest. You're not in a legal proceeding. You're sitting in a room with me, and the only path through this room that ends somewhere other than completely badly for you is the one where you tell me who gave you the harbor file. The room held. Chaeyeon's jaw moved. Once. Like she was working on something, deciding which container to put it in. I want something in writing, she said, about my position here. Ji-ho looked at her for a long moment. You just told me there's something to trade, he said. That's useful. We'll discuss what that looks like after you give me a name. Another long pause. Then Chaeyeon said a name. Not Sarah Han. Assemblyman Han himself. Ji-ho's expression did not move. That was the discipline. 20 years of building the reflex, the absolute refusal to let a room see what was happening inside when something landed that mattered. He felt it land. He processed it in the 2 seconds before he spoke again, and the processing produced a revised architecture of everything he thought he understood about the past 14 months. Assemblyman Han had not used Sarah as the instrument. He had gone around Sarah, around his own daughter, which meant either Sarah didn't know or the assemblyman understood that Sarah's personal investment in the situation made her unreliable as an operative. He had found Chaeyeon through a channel that would take Kang's team additional time to fully trace, had fed her the harbor file information through an intermediary, and had let her execute the construction of the documents with enough distance between himself and the output that a first-level investigation would stop at Chaeyeon and go no further. The plan was good. It would have worked if Zora had not thought to pull the supplemental camera footage. If Zora had not been the person who installed the supplemental camera in the first place. How long? Ji-ho said. The contact came 3 weeks after the gala last year, Chaeyeon said. Her voice had settled into something flatter now. The particular flatness of a person who has decided that cooperation is the only geometry left. Someone approached me, said they represented interests that were concerned about certain access patterns inside Mujin International. They said there were questions about Ms. Whitfield's loyalties. They gave me documentation, not the harbor file itself, summaries, enough to understand what had been unresolved. They asked me to monitor and report. Monitor and report for how long before the documents? 14 months. Ji-ho was quiet. 14 months. Cheon had been feeding information about Zora's movements, her access patterns, her relationships inside the building for 14 months. While Zora was catching compliance flags and paying for emergency flights and building transition documentation for a resignation that Assemblyman Han's apparatus had been working to make permanent and damaging for over a year. "Get out," Ji-ho said. Cheon blinked. "The arrangement you mentioned?" "I said get out of this room." His voice had not risen. It was completely controlled and completely clear, and the temperature of it made Cheon push her chair back and stand and walk to the door without further negotiation. Kong's man opened the door for her. Kong spoke quietly to him as Cheon passed. 3 words. The 3 words that meant she would be escorted to a room on the 2nd floor and would remain there with her phone and her things until the next stage of this was determined. The door closed. Ji-ho sat alone with Kong for a moment. "Han," Kong said. "Yes." "The political exposure, Iki. I understand the exposure." Ji-ho stood. "Get me everything. His communication records with Mujin International for the past 2 years. Every meeting, every call log, every document exchange. And get me his scheduler's schedule for the 3 days around each of Cheon's terminal accesses. If this goes legal, it's going to go further than legal." Ji-ho straightened his jacket. "But first I need to make a phone call." He walked out. Zora heard the executive floor shift and register at approximately 6:15. It was not a sound exactly, more a change in the texture of the building's activity, the way air pressure changes before weather. Voices recalibrated, movement patterns adjusted. She had worked in this environment long enough to read the building the way some people read faces. Something had come out of the conference room. At 6:22, Ji-ho came back to his office. He stopped at her desk. "Han," he said. "1 word." She nodded once. "Sarah may or may not have known," he said. "I don't have that answer yet." "It doesn't change what Sarah said to me," Zora said, "but it changes what it means." Ji-ho looked at her. "You're not surprised?" "I'm surprised it was the assemblyman directly. I thought there'd be more distance." He miscalculated the camera," she said. "He calculated everything else correctly." Ji-ho held her gaze for a moment. "I'm calling a full alliance gathering. 3 nights from now, the Celestial Crown Ballroom." "What are you using as the reason?" "Quarterly alliance review. Standard format." He paused. "Everyone will come. It's obligatory." She looked at him. She understood what he was building. A gathering of the full alliance. Every senior captain, every political affiliate, every corporate partner with a stake in Mujin International's structure. The kind of event where the room's collective attention was pre-organized, where whatever happened in it happened in front of the maximum possible witness set. Ji-ho, "I know," he said. 3 days to prepare." He went into his office. She sat at her desk. She had the particular feeling of standing at the edge of something that, once begun, could not be stopped in the middle. The gathering was a public arena. What Ji-ho was building toward a public arena was not a quarterly review. It was a reckoning, and the difference between a reckoning that produced the intended outcome and one that destroyed everything it touched was preparation. Detail. The correct sequencing of information and exposure. She opened her computer. She began to prepare. The 3 days were the most compressed work she had done in 3 years, which was a meaningful benchmark. She coordinated venue logistics while simultaneously building an information package, legal, financial, operational, that documented the harbor incident's actual source question against the manufactured documentation, the metadata evidence, the camera footage chain, and the relationship between Assemblyman Han's office and Cheon's 14-month reporting pattern. She worked with Kang's team on the evidentiary structure, not because she was an investigator, but because she understood documentation architecture, and the documentation architecture needed to be airtight. She slept approximately 4 hours a night for 3 nights. The dark circles appeared by the 2nd morning, and she did not attempt to manage them because there was not time, and because they were accurate. They were what 3 days of this work looked like on a human face, and she was not going to perform a comfort she didn't have. Ji-ho worked. She was aware of him working in the way she was always aware of him. The light in his office when she arrived in the morning, the pattern of calls, the rhythm of his movement through the executive floor. He did not ask her how she was doing, which she appreciated. Asking would have required her to divert processing power to the answer, and she did not have processing power to spare. On the second day, Sarah Han called the main line. Zora took the call. There was a pause on Sarah's end when she heard Zora's voice. I expected... Ji-ho is unavailable, Zora said. Can I take a message? Another pause, longer. Is the gathering still scheduled? Sarah asked. Yes. Your father has received his invitation through the Standard Alliance communication, Zora said. The event is mandatory for all senior affiliates. A silence that was different from the pauses, heavier, and shaped differently, like a person standing very still because moving in any direction was dangerous. Ms. Whitfield, Sarah said. Yes. I didn't... Sarah stopped, started again. Whatever you think about what I said to you, I didn't know what my father was doing. Zora held the phone and looked at her screen and thought about Sarah sitting across her desk, saying structural realities in a voice like a woman reading from a document she had already written. She thought about the timing, 9 days after the gala, 4 days after the resignation letter. A woman who had said exactly the right things to ensure Zora's departure felt inevitable just before the manufactured documentation surfaced to make it catastrophic. She thought about whether Sarah had known and deployed it consciously, or whether she had simply said what she believed and the timing had been her father's calculation. She did not know, and the not knowing was its own kind of information. I'll pass along any message you'd like to leave, Zora said. Sarah hung up. The night of the gathering arrived with the particular weight of things that have been built toward and cannot be postponed. Zora dressed in her office. She had brought the clothes with her that morning, not the emerald dress, not anything designed to make a visual statement, but something deliberate nonetheless. A deep charcoal suit, fitted correctly, the kind that said, I am here in a professional capacity, and I am not uncertain about my right to be in this room. She had slept 3 hours the night before, and her eyes were sharp with the specific clarity of exhaustion that has passed through the foggy stage and come out the other side into something crystalline and a little dangerous. She looked at herself in the small mirror behind her office door. She looked like someone who had been through something and was still standing. Good. The Celestial Crown Ballroom was on the 42nd floor of a building in Midtown that Mujin International held partial ownership of. And it was the kind of room that had been designed with the understanding that power likes to look at itself. The proportions were imperial. The lighting was warm and precise. The table configuration for a full alliance gathering placed Ji-ho at the head and organized the room by tier, senior captains, corporate partners, political affiliates, operational leadership, in a sequence that made the organization's hierarchy visually legible to anyone who understood it. Zora had coordinated the seating herself. She had placed Assemblyman Han at the seat that was closest to the head of the table without being among the senior captains, a position that said valued affiliate without conferring the authority of proximity. She had placed his seat with approximately 8 inches less space between it and the next chair than any other seat at the table. Not enough to be obvious, enough to be slightly, persistently uncomfortable. She had learned to work in inches. She arrived before most of the guests and stood near the logistics station with a tablet and her event coordinator face, which was the neutral, capable expression that allowed her to be in any corner of a room without appearing to be observing it. She watched guests arrive. She noted body language. She tracked the particular geometry of people who were anxious and performing normalcy against people who were anxious without knowing why. Assemblyman Han arrived at 7:43. He was a man in his early 60s with the groomed confidence of someone who had operated near power for long enough that the proximity had calcified into a kind of personal authority, the assumption that rooms would organize around him, that his arrival would be registered and responded to. He greeted 3 people at the entrance with the handshake of a man who expected the handshakes to be warmer than they were. They were 2 degrees cooler than he expected. He felt it. She watched him feel it, the micro-adjustment in his smile, the slight recalibration of his posture as he moved deeper into the room. He was a smart man. He was reading the room, and the room was telling him something he didn't have enough information to fully decode yet. Sarah arrived 4 minutes later. She was composed in the specific way of a woman who has spent the past 3 days preparing to be composed, which is different from actual composure and visible to anyone who knows the difference. She scanned the room when she entered, looking for Ji-ho, Zora assumed, And then Zora saw Sarah find her instead, and their eyes met across 40 feet of ballroom for approximately 2 seconds before Sarah looked away. Ji-ho arrived at 8 exactly. He was never late to events he controlled, and he was never early. 8 o'clock meant the room would be full and settled, and the collective attention would have already organized into the waiting posture that full rooms take on when the principal hasn't arrived yet. He walked in with Director Kong at his right shoulder and 2 senior captains flanking them, and the room did the thing it always did when Ji-ho entered. It oriented. Not obviously. Not with any announced deference. Just the slight gravitational adjustment of a room recognizing where its center was. He did not look at Zora when he entered. She noted this and filed it correctly. Not avoidance, positioning. He was constructing the evening's geometry. And she was part of the geometry, which meant her position was calculated and his acknowledgement of it would come at the calculated moment. She went back to her tablet and her logistics face, and she watched the room settle. The formal portion of the evening began at 8:30 with the quarterly business review, which was real. She had built it to be real, complete and defensible, because a fabricated pretext was its own vulnerability, and she did not build vulnerabilities. Ji-ho delivered the review with his standard precision, and the room listened with the particular quality of people who understand that the content is not the point and are waiting to understand what the point is. At 9:15, Ji-ho paused. He set down the document he'd been referencing. He looked at the room. "There's a second item," he said. The room's quality changed. Not the temperature, something more specific. The attentiveness sharpened in the way it sharpens when people who operate in high-risk environments register that the register of a conversation has shifted into a territory they need to track very carefully. 14 months ago, Ji-ho said, this organization sustained a significant operational loss. 3 contracts, 2 political relationships, 1 asset. He spoke without inflection, delivering the inventory of it. The investigation concluded the loss resulted from an internal intelligence failure. The investigation did not identify the source. Silence. The source has now been identified. The silence was different now. The specific quality of a room full of people who have collectively stopped moving. Ji-ho looked at Assemblyman Han. He did not look away. Han was good. He was a politician with 30 years of practice at receiving information in public that required private processing, and his face produced the correct expression, engaged, attentive, appropriately serious. But his hands, which were below the table level and therefore not visible to most of the room, were visible to Zora from her position at the logistics station, because she had chosen her position at the logistics station specifically. His right thumb pressed into the base of his left palm. Once. Hard. The intelligence failure was produced by a document fabrication, Ji-ho said. Manufactured inside this building 9 days ago. Backdated to the operational window. Designed to place the source identification on a member of this organization's staff who had no involvement in the original loss and no access to the operational materials that would have made involvement possible. Ji-ho reached forward. He picked up a remote. He turned toward the screen behind him. The screen displayed the metadata report. Clean, technical, inarguable. The creation dates, the machine IDs, the IP address discrepancies. Kang had formatted it with the specific clarity of a document built for rooms where people would try to find the counterargument, and there was no counterargument available in the metadata. The second slide showed the camera footage, not Cheon's face, the supplemental camera image, the stairwell profile, 3/4 view. The third slide showed the communication records between Cheon's established contact, the intermediary, and a phone number that Kong's team had spent 48 hours tracing through 3 layers of prepaid registration to a device purchased in cash from a retail location in Newark, whose security camera had captured a purchase, and whose footage showed a young man who, when located and interviewed by Kong's people, had identified the person who gave him the cash and the instructions. Ji-ho did not name Han on the third slide. He let the room look at the communication record. He let the room see the call pattern. 14 months of contact, the frequency of it, the dates that aligned with each of Cheon's reporting intervals, the final cluster of calls in the 9 days after the gala. He let the room do the math. Rooms full of captains, politicians, and corporate operators are very fast at math. Han pushed his chair back approximately 3 centimeters. An unconscious movement, the body seeking space before the mind has decided what to do with the information. He caught it and stopped. His jaw was set. His eyes had gone to a particular quality that Zora had seen before in people who understood that they were inside a situation that had moved past the point where they controlled the variables. The staff member whose name was placed in this fabrication, Ji-ho said, has been with this organization for 3 years. Her record in that time represents work that I am going to describe specifically, because this room is owed the specificity. He began listing it, not in the generic terms of a performance review, in the operational terms that the people in this room understood, the compliance flags that had prevented federal exposure, the security adjustment that had prevented a warehouse ambush, the negotiation sequencing that had preserved a political alliance worth considerably more than the 3 contracts lost in the harbor incident. He listed the junior employee protections, the emergency support, the 14 hours of average weekly additional work performed without compensation request or title recognition. He listed it in a voice that had no performance in it, no crescendo, no editorial coloring, just the inventory, delivered with the same flatness he'd used for the quarterly review. Zora stood at the logistics station and listened to herself being described, and it was one of the more disorienting experiences she had ever had in a professional environment. Not uncomfortable. Disorienting, the specific vertigo of hearing your own work given its full weight by the person you had done it for, in a room full of people who had previously allocated you to a category marked peripheral. When Ji-ho finished the inventory, the room was very still. Her resignation, Ji-ho said, was submitted 9 days ago, concurrent with the surfacing of the fabricated documentation. He picked up a piece of paper from the table in front of him. The room recognized it, not the content, the gesture. A piece of paper held in a specific way, in a specific room, carried meaning in an organization like this. Every person in the ballroom understood that what Ji-ho was holding was significant, and that what he did with it next would be a statement about something larger than its content. He tore it apart. Not dramatically, not with a gesture built for theatrical impact, but cleanly, with the matter-of-fact quality of someone disposing of something that has been determined to be invalid. The pieces fell onto the table in front of him, and he left them there. She does not stand in this building because she works for me, Ji-ho said. He was looking at the room, not at Zora, but his peripheral orientation had shifted in her direction, and everyone in the room could read the shift. She stands in this building because there is no person here who has earned the category of trust she has earned. And what was done to her name in this investigation was done deliberately, with full understanding of what it was, by a person who calculated that she was the most effective instrument available for the removal of someone this organization cannot afford to lose. He looked at Han. The room looked at Han. Han's expression was a controlled disaster, the surface holding its shape while the infrastructure beneath it showed the stress fractures of a structure that had not been built for the specific load it was now carrying. His chin lifted, his posture squared. These were the reflexes of a man who had survived political confrontation before and was reaching for the tools that had worked in those rooms. He was in the wrong room. "These are serious allegations," Han said. His voice was even, measured. The voice of a man who understood that the first 30 seconds of response in a room like this would set the frame of everything that followed. "I'd expect supporting documentation beyond a communication record that hasn't been authenticated in any legal—" "The intermediary gave a signed statement," Ji-ho said. "This morning." Han's voice stopped. Ji-ho let the stop breathe for 3 full seconds. "I'm not interested in a legal proceeding," Ji-ho said. "What happens outside this room is a separate question. What happens in this room is a declaration of what this organization considers its standards. And this organization's standard is that a person who builds a fabrication against a loyal and blameless member of our structure, using intelligence they obtained through a relationship with this alliance, has ended that relationship." He looked at Han without expression. "You're no longer an affiliate of the Mujin Alliance," Ji-ho said. "Effective tonight. The political arrangements that operated through your office will be restructured through alternative channels. The investment positions will be divested on the schedule. Kong's office will communicate to you by morning." A pause. "This is not a negotiation." Han stood. And something happened that Zora had not predicted. Sarah stood too. She stood and she looked at her father with an expression that contained something that Zora, watching from 40 feet away, could not fully read. Not quite horror, not quite anger, something that was both of those things processed through the specific devastation of a woman who has just understood that the man she trusted most in her life used her as ambient cover for something that required her not to know. "Dad," Sarah said. Han looked at his daughter. The look between them lasted approximately 4 seconds and contained more information than Zora was entitled to access. She looked away from it. It was not hers. Han straightened. He looked at Ji-ho. "The documentation," he started, "is complete," Ji-ho said, "and has been communicated to the appropriate parties outside this room. What you do next is your decision." Han turned and walked toward the exit. His security moved with him, 2 men who had the careful expressions of people who understood that their employer had just become a significantly different kind of liability than he was 4 hours ago. The door closed. The room did not erupt. It did not produce the dramatic exhale that rooms and stories produce when the confrontation resolves. It produced instead a very particular quality of silence, the silence of rooms full of smart, powerful people who are processing what they have just witnessed and running the implications against their own positions, their own alliances, their own calculations about what this organization now meant and who its center of gravity was. Adrian Vale stood up. He began to applaud. It was not a theatrical gesture from Adrian. He was not a theatrical person. It was a deliberate, considered action, the kind that a man performs when he has decided that the moment requires a declaration and he is willing to make it. He stood, and he applauded, and he looked at Zora across the room, not at Ji-ho, and his expression said something that was not complicated. This was correct, and it is overdue. Captain Seo stood. Then Kim, then 3 of the corporate partners, then the operational leadership, one by one, with the particular timing of people who had made individual decisions and happened to be making them in the same direction at the same moment. Zora stood at the logistics station and felt the sound of it, the collective weight of a room full of people deciding to acknowledge something. And she did not allow her expression to shift into anything that looked like relief, because relief was a private feeling, and this was a public room and she still had work to do. Ji-ho came off the stage. He walked across the ballroom floor toward her. The room was still applauding. Not all of it, not theatrically, but enough of it that the sound was continuous and real, and Zora was aware of it, the way you're aware of something that is happening around you while you are focused on the immediate geometry in front of you. Ji-ho stopped 2 feet from her. He reached into his jacket. He held out the pieces of the resignation letter. She looked at them. "I said it before," he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it over the room. "I'm saying it more clearly now. This letter is not valid. Your position in this organization belongs to you, not as a function of what just happened, not as a function of anything between us that isn't resolved yet." He held her gaze. "Because of what you built here, which this room now knows, and which cannot be unmade." She looked at the pieces. She looked at him. "You tore it up," she said. "Yes. That doesn't mean you get to decide whether I stay." Something moved in his face. Not surprise. Something quieter than surprise. The recognition of a person who has heard exactly the right thing said back to them at exactly the right moment. "No," he said. "It doesn't." He lowered his hand, still holding the pieces. He did not put them away. He held them and waited, which was not something Ji-ho typically did, waited without directing the outcome. And the waiting itself was a statement that was more legible to her than any of the words in the ballroom had been. Zora looked at the room. She looked at the people still standing. She looked at Adrian, who had sat back down and was watching her with the expression of a man who had said what he came to say and was content with however the room received it. She looked back at Ji-ho. "The position isn't chief of staff," she said. He blinked. One of the very few times she had ever produced a blink from him. "The work I've been doing," she said, "for 3 years. It isn't executive support work. You know that. The leadership meeting told you that. What I've actually been doing is strategy, operations, risk management, intelligence, in the sense that matters in an organization like this." She kept her voice level and clear and looked at him directly. "If I stay in the position that reflects what I've actually been doing. Not a title that describes what I was hired for. The title that describes what I've been for 3 years." The room had quieted enough that the people nearest to them could likely hear the exchange. She was aware of that, and she had decided, when she was drafting what she intended to say, that she was not going to soften it to account for the audience. Softening it would have been its own kind of shrinking, and she was done shrinking. Ji-ho looked at her for a long moment. "Chief Strategy Officer," he said. "Corporate Operations, Risk Architecture, Alliance Intelligence." "Yes." "That position doesn't currently exist." "I know. You'd have to create it. Tonight." "Publicly," she said. "In this room. So that it is not a favor or a concession or something that can be quietly restructured after the moment passes." Another pause. Something happened in Ji-ho's face that she had seen only 3 times in 3 years. The moment when his calculation and his instinct arrived at the same place simultaneously, and the arriving produced something visible. Not warmth, exactly. Something more durable than warmth. He turned to the room. "Mugen International's structure," he said, in a voice that carried, "will include, effective immediately, a Chief Strategy Officer position overseeing corporate operations, risk architecture, and alliance intelligence." He turned back to Zora. "The position is filled." The room processed this. Adrian began applauding again. This time it was faster to spread. Zora stood in the middle of it, and she thought about 3 years of parking structure mornings, and Chaeyeon's voice in the corridor, and Sarah Han's structural realities, and the green dress, and 3 seconds when Ji-ho had turned and had nothing to say. She thought about the resignation letter in pieces in his hand. She thought about transition documentation she had built with the care she built everything with, which she now would not have to hand to anyone. She thought about the fact that her hands were steady. She checked them. They were. Then Sarah Han was standing in front of her. She had appeared at Zora's left side, not from across the room, from nearby, which meant she had moved during the applause, and Zora had not tracked it because Zora had been looking at Ji-ho. Sarah's expression was not the composed surface of the entrance or the devastated one from her father's departure. It was something stripped of its infrastructure. Not ugly, not performed, just a face without its armor on, which was, Zora reflected, probably the most honest she had ever seen Sarah Han look. "The things I said to you," Sarah said, "in your office." Zora looked at her. "Some of them were things my father told me to believe," Sarah said. "I don't know which ones were mine." She said this with the particular difficulty of someone who has recently discovered that their independent conclusions were load-bearing walls someone else had built. "I'm not asking for anything. I know that's not—" She stopped. "I just wanted to say it." Zora considered her. "I appreciate that," she said. Sarah nodded. She started to turn. "Sarah," Zora said. Sarah turned back. "The things that were yours," Zora said quietly, "you'll know them because they'll still feel true when you're standing somewhere other than your father's shadow." Sarah looked at her for a moment. Then she walked away. Ji-ho appeared at Zora's right shoulder. Not touching, just there, in the close proximity that was its own statement in a room like this. "Adrian wants to say something to me," Ji-ho said. "He deserves an apology." "I know, I'm going to give him one." "A real one," she said. "Not a Kwon Ji-ho version of one where you acknowledge an error and immediately redirect to operational implications." He looked at her sideways. "A real one," he said. "Yes." She watched him cross the room toward Adrian. She watched the conversation begin. Ji-ho's posture, which was not its usual configuration, not the full authority stance, something slightly more human in it, and Adrian's face, which went through several things before it settled into the particular expression of a man receiving something he had not been certain would come, but had quietly hoped for. They shook hands. Adrian said something. Ji-ho said something back. It lasted 4 minutes, and neither of them looked uncomfortable by the end of it, which was the closest this room would get to a resolution between those two men, and it was enough. Zora looked at the ballroom. She looked at the remains of the evening, guests in conversation, the organizational topology rearranging itself in real time around the new information, the new positions, the new distribution of what was known and what had been acknowledged publicly. She thought about the documentation package sitting face down on the side table in her office. She thought about the work that would need to begin, in the morning, with a new title and a blank sheet of paper, building the actual infrastructure of a position that had just been created in a ballroom with an audience of 120 people. She thought about the fact that she was exhausted in a way that 3 nights of 4 hours would not have produced on its own, the bone-deep kind of tired that comes from carrying weight for a long time, and then having some of it lifted, which paradoxically makes you feel the remainder more acutely rather than less. She needed to sit down. She found a chair near the window at the edge of the room's activity, and she sat down and set her tablet on the table beside her and looked out at the Manhattan skyline through the 42nd floor glass and let the evening process for the first time all night. She heard footsteps and knew them before she looked. Ji-ho sat in the chair beside her, not across from her, beside her, which was different from every other configuration of the two of them in chairs that had existed in the past 3 years. He sat with the posture of a man who has done what he came to do and is now sitting, just sitting, without a strategic purpose to the sitting. They both looked at the skyline. "Chief Strategy Officer," he said. "Yes." "You knew I'd say yes." "I knew the math was correct," she said. "Whether you do the math was a separate question." He was quiet for a moment. "The other question?" he said. She looked at the skyline. "Still in its column," she said. "I'm not ready to take it out of the column yet." "I know. I need this." She gestured slightly at the room, at the evening, at all of it, to settle. "I need to be standing in a different place than I was standing 2 weeks ago before I look at it directly, because right now I can't tell which parts are real and which parts are adrenaline." "That's fair," he said. "The position is real," she said. "Tonight made it real. Everything else needs its own time." "Yes," he said. They sat together in the chairs by the window and the ballroom continued around them and nobody approached them, which was itself a kind of organizational intelligence, a room full of people who understood that this particular configuration did not require management. Zora looked at her reflection in the 42nd floor glass, the charcoal suit, the dark circles, the face of someone who had been through something and was still sitting upright, and she thought about everything that had led to this chair, this view, this evening. She thought about the green dress, still hanging in her closet. She thought about the next morning and the blank sheet of paper and the work. Outside, 42 floors below, the city moved with its usual indifference, cabs and pedestrians, and the anonymous machinery of a place that did not register individual reckonings. It went on regardless. It always did. Ji-ho sat beside her and said nothing further, and she sat beside him and said nothing further, and outside the window the city's 10,000 lights held steady against the dark, and somewhere in the building structure the ventilation cycled on, and the evening was not yet over, and the hardest part, the part that came after the reckoning, the part where you had to build something new from what remained, had not yet begun. The morning after the celestial crown gathering came in gray and quiet, the way mornings do after evenings that have taken everything out of a room and left it swept clean. Zora was at her desk by 7. Not the executive secretary desk. She had moved, in the 20 minutes before anyone else arrived on the floor, to the office 2 doors down from Ji-ho's that had been vacant since the previous chief operations officer left 8 months ago. She had not asked for authorization to move. She had carried her laptop, her leather portfolio, her travel mug, and the single-framed photograph she kept on her desk. Her mother, younger than Zora was now, laughing at something off camera. And she had set them on the desk in the new office and sat down and opened her laptop and begun working. The photograph had been the last thing she placed. She set it at the left corner of the desk where she could see it without turning her head, the position it had always occupied, and she looked at it for a moment. The laugh, the youth, the off-camera joy, and she thought about what her mother would have said about the previous evening. Her mother would have said, "Good. Now, what are you going to do with it?" She opened a new document. She titled it CSO, Structural Framework, Month 1. She began. The first person to find her in the new office was Adrian at 8:43. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. "You moved," he said. 2 doors down." He looked at the office, its current spareness, the single photograph, the laptop on a desk that was otherwise empty. "You need furniture." "I need a whiteboard and 3 filing cabinets. The furniture can wait." He came in and leaned against the door frame with the relaxed posture he had always carried, the ease that was genuine rather than performed. He looked at her with the expression of a man who has been through something alongside someone and is assessing the aftermath. "How are you?" he said. She considered giving him the professional answer and decided he had earned the honest one. "Tired in a way I haven't identified all the layers of yet," she said. "Functional, clearer than I expected to be." He nodded. Ji-ho apologized to me last night. I know. I told him to. A slight smile. Was it a real one? I told him it had to be. She looked at him directly. Was it? Adrian considered. It was the closest I've seen him get. He paused. Which, for Ji-ho, is considerable. Yes, she said. It is. He straightened from the doorframe. The captains want a briefing, on your role, what the CSO position means for how they interact with the corporate structure. Schedule it for Thursday. Give me 2 days to build the framework document first, so the briefing has something to anchor to. Thursday, he said. Done. He started to turn, then stopped. The green dress thing, at the gala, I want to say, Adrian. I need to say it. She waited. I asked you to dinner because I thought you were interesting, he said. Not because I was trying to provoke anything. I want you to know that what happened after, what Ji-ho did, that was not a consequence I intended or would have chosen. I know, she said. What happened after was Ji-ho's, not yours. I also want you to know that nothing about this, he indicated the office, the building, the general shape of everything that had shifted, changes what I said that night. You are interesting, and you deserve to be asked to dinner by someone who is paying attention. He paused. Whatever else happens. She looked at him. Thank you, Adrian, she said. Genuinely. He nodded once and left. She sat with the quiet that followed for approximately 30 seconds. Then she went back to her document. Ji-ho appeared at 9:20. He did not knock, which was consistent. He had never knocked on the executive secretary office, and the habits of 3 years did not reconstruct themselves at 9 in the morning. He stepped inside, registered the new arrangement, and stood in the middle of the office with the specific look of a man recalibrating a space he had previously understood. You moved, he said. You made me chief strategy officer last night. The chief strategy officer doesn't sit 2 doors down from the executive secretary pool. He looked at the empty desk, the single photograph, the laptop. You need a whiteboard and 3 filing cabinets. Yes, I've already submitted the facility's request. He looked at her. She looked at him. In the daylight, after sleep, after the accumulated weight of the previous evening had settled into its permanent positions, he looked like a person who had come through something and was assessing the exit point. The marble face was in place. It was always in place at this hour, in this building, but underneath it, she could read, in the way she had been reading him for 3 years, the specific quality of a man who had said things publicly the night before that he had not previously said privately, and was now in the morning of that, which was a different country from the evening. The assemblyman, she said. What happens now? Legally, nothing immediately. The documentation was shared with federal contacts, people who have had existing interest in his office's activities for reasons that predate this. He came to the chair across from her desk and sat in it, which was a reversal that neither of them commented on. The political exposure is significant. His coalition fractured last night within 3 hours. I had calls before midnight. The alliance positions will be divested on schedule. Whether what he built over 30 years survives the next 18 months is his problem. Cheon, she said, terminated. This morning, before 7. She'll receive a reference that says she resigned for personal reasons, which is the version of this that serves everyone's interest, including hers, because the alternative is a document trail that makes her unemployable anywhere adjacent to finance or government. That's more than she earned. Yes, he said. It is. I'm making a calculation about what this building needs to see, which is that the consequences were real but not obliterating. It makes people feel safer about the institution. He looked at her steadily. You disagree. I think she spent 14 months helping someone build a case against me, Zora said. And I think a clean reference is a gift she's going to spend the next 5 years not understanding the weight of. But I understand the institutional logic, she paused. I don't have to agree with it to understand it. That's new, he said. What is? You telling me when you disagree with a decision. She held his gaze. That's what the title requires. If you wanted someone who agreed with your decisions, you should have hired someone who agreed with your decisions. Something settled in his face. Not quite a smile. Ji-ho's face did not produce full smiles with any regularity, a fact she had catalogued years ago, but the anterior motion of one. The place where a smile would be if the architecture permitted it. The framework document, she said. CSO structural mandate. I'll have a draft for your review by end of day tomorrow. I'll clear time Thursday morning. Adrian is scheduling a captain's briefing for Thursday. Mid-morning. The framework should come first. 9 o'clock, he said. 8:30, she said. I want the full hour before Adrian's group arrives. He looked at her. 8:30, he said. He stood. He moved toward the door. He stopped at the threshold. The second time in 3 years she had watched him stop at a threshold when leaving a room she was in, the first being the morning after the gala when he had said, "I'm sorry," in the voice she didn't have a category for. Last night, he said, without turning around, when you said you needed things to settle, before you looked at the other column. She set her pen down. I'm not asking, he said. I'm saying that I understand what you meant, and I'm not going to complicate the work with the other thing. Not until you indicate. He paused, and the pause had the quality of a man being more careful with language than he usually had to be. That the column is available. She looked at his back, the line of his shoulders, the jacket that was always exactly as it should be. I'll tell you, she said. He nodded. He left. She picked her pen back up. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping, and the framework document began to take the shape she had been carrying in her head for 3 years without knowing she was carrying it. The first week of the new position was the hardest. Not because the work was unfamiliar, the work was exactly what she had been doing, with the difference that now it had a title and formal authority and a budget line and meetings she chaired rather than coordinated. The hardness came from the adjustment of the people around her, which was not uniform and was not fast and was not comfortable for anyone including her. Some of the senior captains arrived at Thursday's briefing with the specific posture of men who had decided to give this arrangement the benefit of the doubt and were communicating that they were doing so. This was better than open resistance, but it was its own kind of wait, the performance of provisional acceptance, the waiting to see whether she would produce evidence of incompetence that would retroactively validate their original assessment. She had done her work in this environment long enough to recognize the posture and to understand the only response to it was the same response that had always worked: show up and do the work correctly. She did. She ran the Thursday briefing without notes. She presented the structural framework for the CSO position in terms that connected directly to the captain's operational realities. How intelligence flow would change, how risk flags would be communicated, how the corporate layer would interact with the operational layer with her office, as the architecture between them. She answered questions directly, including 2 that were framed as tests rather than genuine inquiries. She answered the test questions the same way she answered the genuine ones. At the end of the briefing, Captain Seo, who had been in Ji-ho's organization longer than anyone else in the room and whose skepticism was the most legible and therefore the most important to address, said, "The Yoon negotiation. Walk me through the meeting sequence adjustment." Zora walked him through it. All the way through, the decision tree, the risk calculation, the alternative sequences she had considered and rejected, the specific vulnerability she had been managing in the relationship between 2 political factions that Seo himself had not been aware of. When she finished, Seo was quiet for a moment. How long had you been tracking that, he said. 4 months before the negotiation, she said. It was moving slowly. I had time. You never flagged it. I didn't need to until the negotiation created the window. Flagging it earlier would have created pressure to act before the pressure was useful. Seo looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating expression of a man running new data against an existing model and finding the model insufficient. Thursday at the same time next week, he said. I want to talk about the Incheon situation. I'll be here, she said. After the captains left, she sat alone in the briefing room for approximately 4 minutes. She looked at the whiteboard, her handwriting in 3 colors, the structural diagram she had built in real time during the questions, the way it had grown from its original shape as the conversation developed. She looked at it and thought about the fact that she had drawn something similar, in her head, 100 times over the past 3 years. And the difference between drawing it in your head and drawing it on a whiteboard in front of the people who needed to see it was the difference between existing and being acknowledged to exist. She erased the whiteboard. She went back to her office. The weeks assembled themselves into a month, and the month had its own texture. The accumulation of 8:30 meetings with Ji-ho and Thursday briefings with CO and the daily work of building a position from the ground up while simultaneously running its actual functions. Because the organization's strategic needs did not pause for the infrastructure of the person responsible for addressing them. She hired an assistant. Not to replace what she had been, she understood too specifically what she had been to think a hire would replicate it, but to handle the logistics and calendar management that the CSO role needed cleared from her plate to function at its actual level. She hired a woman named Dara, 28, from outside the Mujin ecosystem, sharp and direct and completely unburdened by the organization's history with Zora's name. Dara arrived, assessed the situation with the practical clarity of someone who had no prior context for any of it, and began working. The first time Dara did something that exceeded her job description, caught an error in a legal filing, corrected it, mentioned it to Zora in passing as if it were self-evident. Zora stopped what she was doing and looked at her. "Good catch," she said. Dara looked slightly surprised. "It was obvious." "I know," Zora said. "I'm saying it anyway." Dara went back to work. Zora sat for a moment and thought about 3 years of catches and corrections that had been obvious and had not been said. She thought about the cost of the unsaid and the compounding of it, the way it accumulates into a deficit that a person carries without quite naming it. She thought about Dara, 28, at the beginning of something, and the difference that being told "good catch" at the beginning made to the shape of what came after. She made a note. Not in any system, just in her own accounting. On a Tuesday evening in the 6th week, she stayed late. This was not unusual. She had stayed late for 3 years, and the habit of it had not dissolved with the change in title. But this evening, she stayed late because she was finishing something she wanted to finish, not because anyone had asked her to. And the distinction between those two things was new and quietly significant. She was deep in a risk analysis for the Inchin restructure when she heard Ji-ho's door open. She heard his footsteps. She still knew his footsteps, the 3-year familiarity of them. And she heard them come to her door and stop. She kept working for a moment. Then she looked up. He was in the doorway with his jacket off, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which was the configuration she associated with late evenings and the specific kind of problem-solving that required slightly less formal armor. He looked at her with the expression that had replaced the professional evaluator look over the past 6 weeks, something less constructed, something that didn't require the same amount of maintenance. "You're still here," he said. "Inchin Risk Matrix," she said. "SEO wants it Monday. I want it Wednesday, so I have time to review it twice." "Reasonable." He leaned against the doorframe. "Have you eaten?" She thought about it. "Lunch." "That was 9 hours ago. I had something at my desk around 4. That doesn't count." She looked at him. "What counts?" "Food consumed while sitting down in a room that isn't this one." He pushed off the doorframe. "There's a place 2 blocks down that stays open late. Not expensive. Good enough." She looked at her screen, at the matrix. At the time in the corner, 9:47. She thought about what this was. Not the dinner. The dinner was probably dinner. She thought about the column, which she had kept closed for 6 weeks while things settled, and she thought about whether the settling had produced the clarity she had been waiting for, or whether she was still in the middle of it. She thought about his face in the ballroom when he had held the pieces of her resignation letter and waited without directing the outcome. She thought about the door frames, all the door frames, every threshold where he had stopped and said something true. She thought about "don't go" spoken without authority behind it, just 2 words in a voice that meant only what it said. She thought about the column. She closed her laptop. 2 blocks, she said. 2 blocks, he said. The place was small and underdramatic, which she appreciated. 8 tables, half of them occupied by people who looked like they were also eating late because their days had run long. A menu in Korean and English on a chalkboard. A server who did not register Ji-ho with any visible reaction, which meant either she didn't know who he was or she had seen enough interesting people in this restaurant to have lost the reflex. Either was fine. They sat across from each other at a table near the window. No security at the table. 2 of Ji-ho's detail were at the entrance, visible but not adjacent, which was the configuration he used when he had decided that a situation was personal rather than professional, and the security parameters should reflect that. She had never been in this configuration with him before. 3 years of proximity, and she had never been in a room with him where the parameters were personal. She looked at the menu. You don't know what I like, she said. No, he said. I know your coffee order and your working lunch preferences, and the 3 things you avoid eating at catered events because they affect your concentration. He set down his menu. I don't know what you order when the choice is actually yours. She looked at him. Order for yourself, he said. I'll manage. She ordered the thing she actually wanted, which was not the thing she would have ordered at a business dinner, and he ordered without apparent deliberation, and the server left, and they were at a table with nothing between them that required management. The silence lasted perhaps 6 seconds. Books, he said. She raised an eyebrow. Adrian told me you'd read the Okonkwo history. The long one. The 700-page one. Yes. What did you think? She thought about how to answer that in a way that was honest rather than appropriate. I think it was the best argument I've read for why institutions outlast the people who build them, and why that's both the best and worst thing about institutions. She paused. It made me think about Mujin. He looked at her steadily. In what way? In the way that most of what you've built, she said carefully, is held together by you specifically. Your relationships, your authority, your reputation, which is powerful, and which is also the single greatest structural vulnerability of the organization. She looked at her water glass. That's a CSO observation, not, I know what it is, he said. Say the rest. She looked at him. The alliance system as it currently functions routes everything through your authority as the central node. If that node is destabilized, politically, personally, physically, the organization has no redundant architecture. It's dependent on the center holding. She paused. The harbor incident was expensive because the political relationship that failed had no redundant channel. Han was the single point of contact for that entire government tier. She held his gaze. The CSO position, done correctly, builds the redundant architecture, distributes the load, so the organization doesn't require one person to be indestructible indefinitely. He was quiet for long enough that the food arrived. He looked at what she had ordered. She looked at what he had ordered. You eat the same things at catered events, she said. The choices are usually not interesting enough to take risks on. He picked up his chopsticks. The Okonkwo history. The argument about institutions. Yes. Apply it to the other thing. She stilled. He kept his eyes on his food. You said institutions outlast the people who build them. That's the best and worst of it. He looked up. What you built in this organization, the compliance catches, the security infrastructure, the relationship capital, that exists independently of your title. It was load-bearing before anyone called it load-bearing. He held her gaze. You are not dependent on me recognizing it for it to have been real. I understand that. I also understand that the 3 years during which I failed to recognize it are not redeemable by a ballroom speech. A pause. I'm not trying to redeem them. I'm trying to be clear about what I understand now, which is different from what I understood before. She looked at him. You said you'd tell me, he said, when the column was available. She looked at her food. She looked at the window, the street outside, the ordinary Tuesday night city moving in its ordinary Tuesday night way. She thought about what she wanted, not what was strategic, not what was protected, what she actually wanted, in the way you want things when you have stopped bracing against them. I want to do this slowly, she said. Not because I'm uncertain, because I've spent 3 years moving fast in this environment, and I want this particular thing to have space to be what it is before it has to be anything else. She looked at him directly. I don't want it to be a ballroom story. I don't want it to be the thing people talk about when they talk about last month. I want it to be a Tuesday evening in a small restaurant where we order food we actually want and talk about books. He was quiet. That's available, she said. Something moved in his face. The same thing she had seen 3 times in 3 years, the place where his calculation and his instinct arrived together. But this time it had more room in it, less constructed, less armored, more like a person and less like a position. Tell me about the book, he said. She told him. She talked about the Okonkwo history for 20 minutes, not the professional application of it, but the parts that had moved her, a passage about a community that rebuilt after losing its leadership structure. The way ordinary people had carried the institutional knowledge forward without being asked because the knowledge was theirs, had always been theirs. And the crisis had simply made visible what was already true. He listened the way he listened when he was actually listening, completely still, no performance of attention, just the absence of anything else. It was the quality of attention she had noticed about him in the first week of working for him and had never stopped respecting. When she finished, he said, "There's a history of the Joseon administrative system that covers some of the same territory. The institutional collapse, the way knowledge migrates." He paused. "It's denser than 700 pages, but the argument is better structured." "Send me the title," she said. "I'll bring it," he said. "I have 2 copies." She looked at him. "Next week," he said. Next week is fine," she said. They finished eating, the restaurant thinned, the server cleared their plates with the unhurried efficiency of someone who understood that the last customers of the evening were often the ones who needed the table the longest, and she did not rush them. They walked back to the building together. 2 blocks. Tuesday night. The city doing what the city does. Indifferent, continuous, lit up in all its ordinary ways. Ji-ho's detail kept their distance. She did not think about them. At the building entrance, she stopped. "I'm going to get my things," she said. "The Matrix can wait until morning." He nodded. "Good night, Ji-ho," she said. "Good night," he said. She went upstairs. She collected her laptop and her portfolio and the photograph of her mother, which she carried home every evening because she had developed the habit when her desk was temporary and had kept it because some habits from uncertain periods turn out to be the ones worth keeping. She turned off the light in her office. She walked to the elevator. She did not think about the dinner all the way home. Then she got inside her apartment and set her things down and stood in her kitchen in the quiet and thought about it. And what she felt was not the complicated mixture of column management and structural analysis she had expected. What she felt was simpler than that. The specific simplicity of something that fits, not perfectly, because nothing fit perfectly, and she had spent enough time around perfect-seeming things to understand they were the most expensive kind, but correctly. The way a key fits a lock that was cut for it. She filled a glass of water. She drank it standing at the kitchen counter. She went to bed. The months that followed had their own shape, which was not dramatic. The CSO position built itself into the organization's structure, the way genuine infrastructure builds, not through announcement, but through the gradual transfer of weight onto the architecture, until the architecture was load-bearing and then indispensable. SEO's initial provisional acceptance became something different, not quickly and not without friction, but durably. The Tuesday morning briefings with the senior captains became a fixture. The risk matrix system she implemented for the alliance's political relationships identified 3 potential failures in the first quarter, 2 of which were preventable and 1 of which was not, but was significantly less damaging for being anticipated. The redundant architecture she described over dinner began to take structural form. New relationship channels for the government tier. A formalized intelligence sharing protocol between the operational layer and the corporate layer that did not require everything to route through Ji-ho. A succession framework for the alliance's key partnerships that had never existed before, and whose absence had been, she documented carefully, the single most significant organizational vulnerability in Mujin International's 30-year history. Ji-ho reviewed everything she produced with the same completeness he gave to anything that mattered. He pushed back on 2 sections of the succession framework, pushed back with specificity, with the detailed knowledge of a man who understood his organization at a granular level, and she revised. The second drafts were better than the first because his pushback was correct, and she was not invested in being uncorrected, only in the work being right. They had dinner on 3 more Tuesdays before it became something else. The transition was not an event. It was a sequence of small shifts. The way he started calling her by her name in meetings instead of her title, which was the inverse of the previous 3 years, and took some of the room a week to adjust to. The way she started leaving her office door open when she worked late, which was not a deliberate signal but which he registered and which meant he stopped standing in doorways and started sitting in the chair across from her desk when he wanted to talk about something that wasn't work. The first time he sat in that chair and they talked about something that wasn't work for an hour, she looked at the clock afterward and was genuinely surprised by the hour. "You stayed," she said. "You didn't tell me to leave," he said. "That's not—" she started, and then understood from his expression that it was a small, dry attempt at something she had not previously seen from him in any direct way. Humor. Not the organizational irony he deployed in meetings. Actual humor, the private kind offered to one person. She looked at him. She laughed. It was not a performed laugh. It came out of her without construction, which was a thing that happened less often than it should, and she knew it. He looked at her laugh with the expression of a man who has received something he did not know how much he needed until the moment of its arrival. "Next Tuesday," she said. "Yes," he said. He went back to his office. She sat alone and let the evening settle and thought about what it meant to want something without bracing against it, and decided she was still learning. The thing with Sarah Han resolved itself in a way she had not expected, which was slowly and without conclusion. Sarah called 3 months after the gathering. Not to Ji-ho's office, to Zora's direct line, which meant she had looked up the number specifically and made the choice to dial it. The call was brief. Sarah said she had left her father's political organization. She said she was doing something she did not elaborate on, and she said it with the particular flatness of someone who has recently made a decision that cost them more than they had fully calculated. She did not ask for anything. She asked how Zora was, which was the kind of question that in different circumstances Zora would have answered professionally, and in these circumstances she answered honestly. "Better," Zora said. "Good," Sarah said. There was a pause that neither of them filled. "I owe you more than a phone call," Sarah said. "You don't owe me anything you're not ready to mean," Zora said. Another pause. "The things I said," Sarah said, "about manipulation, about how you gained influence. I know what you said. I believed them. At the time." Sarah's voice had something in it that was difficult to identify, and that Zora thought, listening carefully, was the specific difficulty of a woman reconsidering the foundation of a belief she had held with confidence. "I think I believed them because it was easier than the alternative." The alternative being that a woman like you could simply be better at it than everyone else, Sarah said, without any mechanism I could explain, without any story that made it make sense except the obvious one, which is that you were more competent and more loyal and more attentive than anyone around you, and that the things I assumed required an explanation were just the results of that. Zora was quiet. "My father taught me," Sarah said, "that power always has a hidden architecture, that visible success requires invisible machinery. He was right, actually. He was just wrong about what the machinery was in your case." "He was wrong about a lot of things," Zora said. "Yes," Sarah said. "He was." The call ended shortly after. They did not schedule anything. They did not make promises about future contact. But Zora set her phone down on her desk and sat for a moment and thought about the particular things Sarah had said, "A woman like you," and the way it landed differently than it had in Sarah's office the first time. Different in shape and direction and weight. She thought about her mother's photograph at the corner of her desk. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Assemblyman Han's situation deteriorated over the following 4 months in the specific way of political structures whose corruption has been documented and shared with the correct people. Not dramatically, not a single public collapse, but a series of contractions, each one smaller than the last, that produced in aggregate the kind of diminishment that is harder to survive than a single catastrophic event because each contraction is deniable and the overall pattern is not. He resigned from 2 committees. A major donor withdrew. A newspaper ran a story about his office's financial practices that was factual and sourced, and which he could not counter because the facts and the sources were accurate. Zora followed it in the same way she followed things that were relevant but not hers to manage, attentively, from a distance, without investment in the pace of it. Ji-ho did not follow it at all, at least not visibly, which told her he had already done what he intended to do and had moved on to the next thing, which was the most accurate description of how he operated when something was resolved. On a Saturday in the 4th month, Ji-ho called her. Not a message through the system. Her personal phone, which he had always had as an emergency contact and had used twice in 3 years for operational reasons. "There's a gala tonight," he said. She was at home, in her living room, with the Joseon history he had brought her, the denser one, which he had been right about, and a cup of tea. "I know. I was on the original planning committee before I transitioned out of the coordination role. I want you to come." She set the books down. "As CSO." "No," he said, "with me." She looked at her living room, at the tea, at the book, at the ordinary Saturday afternoon that had been ordinary in the specific way that had recently started to feel like something she had built rather than something that had defaulted. "What time?" she said. 7. I'll have a car at 6:30. I'll be ready, she said. She put on the emerald dress, not because the situation required it, not as a statement or a reclamation or a deliberate callback to the evening that had started all of this. She put it on because it was the right dress, and because she liked it, and because the version of herself who had stood in her closet 14 months ago, weighing the cost of being visible, deserved to have the dress worn without calculation. She checked herself in the mirror. She looked like herself. Which was the point. Ji-ho was at the car when she came out. He looked at the dress. He looked at her face. He did not say anything that was large or performed. He said quietly, "Good." And she understood exactly what he meant, and it was the right thing. The gala was the kind she had coordinated and attended and managed for 3 years. The high-ceilinged rooms, the calibrated lighting, the guest list that was half legitimate and half adjacent to something less formal. She knew every operational detail of its construction because she had reviewed the event plan as part of her role. She did not manage anything. She walked in beside Ji-ho, and she did not carry a tablet, and she did not have her logistics face on. She had her own face on, which was warmer than the logistics face, and somewhat less controlled, and she wore it in a room full of people who had last seen her at the center of a reckoning and who now registered her presence with something that had shifted from the previous register. Not deference, not the performance of respect, but something closer to the genuine article. Captain Seo found her near the entrance. He did not say anything elaborate. He said, "Ms. Whitfield," in a tone that contained 4 months of recalibration compressed into 2 words. "Captain Seo," she said. He moved on. She understood everything that had happened in that exchange. She found Adrian near the bar. "You look," he said, "like someone who isn't working." "I'm not working," she said. He smiled. "How is that?" She thought about it. "It's fine," she said. "It's actually fine." He handed her a drink. The right one, she noticed, because Adrian paid attention. He raised his own. "To the most expensive Tuesday morning briefings in the organization's history," he said, "which I mean entirely as a compliment." She laughed again. "The genuine kind, not the professional kind," and touched her glass to his. "How's the engine restructure?" he said. "Ask me Monday," she said. "Tonight I'm not working." He looked at her with something in his expression that was not complicated. The same look from the morning in her new office. The directness of a man who says what he means and has made his peace with the various shapes things have taken. "Good," he said. "That's exactly right." Across the room, Ji-ho was in conversation with 2 of the corporate partners. She could see him from here, the way he occupied the room, the specific gravity of it, the configuration of his attention. She had read him for 3 years. She could read him now. He was aware of exactly where she was without looking at her, in the same way she was aware of where he was without looking at him. And she thought about how long that particular reciprocal awareness had existed and how long neither of them had named it for what it was. She turned back to Adrian. She told him about the Joseon history. He had not read it, but he had read the sequel, which he described with the specific enthusiasm of a person who reads nonfiction the way some people watch sport, completely, with strong opinions. They talked about it for 20 minutes, and she had the same experience she had when she told Ji-ho about the Okonkwo book. The specific pleasure of talking about something that genuinely interested her in a room where she no longer had to calibrate the talking for professional safety. At 9:15, Ji-ho came to stand beside her. Adrian looked at both of them with the expression of a man who has arrived at a conclusion and is comfortable with it. He excused himself with the grace of someone who understood exactly what he was excusing himself from and bore no resentment about it, which was, Zora thought, one of the more genuinely generous things she had witnessed in a long time. Ji-ho looked at the room. She looked at the room. "The Yoon family is here," he said. "Third table from the east wall." "I saw." The seating worked out better than the original configuration. "You rearranged it. The original put Yoon Sr. next to the park contingent. That hasn't been a comfortable proximity since February." He looked at her sideways. "You rearranged the seating for an event you're attending personally." "Old habits." "They're not habits," he said. "They're you." She considered that. It was true in a way that had taken her a long time to separate from the question of whether it was a problem. The impulse to see and manage and solve. The attention that did not have an off switch. She had spent significant energy over the past months, deciding which parts of that were obligation and which parts were simply who she was, and learning to tell them apart. I rearranged the seating because I noticed a problem, she said. That's not the same as working. No, he agreed. It's not. She looked at the room. At the Yoon family, comfortable in their correctly placed seats. At Seo talking to a corporate partner with the relaxed authority of a man who has recently added a risk framework to his decision-making apparatus and found it improved the quality of his decisions. At Dara, who had apparently also been invited and was in conversation near the bar with a junior captain who was clearly trying to impress her and was not succeeding, which Dara was managing with the diplomatic efficiency that was her most consistent professional attribute. She looked at all of it. She thought about the first Tuesday in this building, the coffee at the right temperature, the revised schedule, the man who looked at both without comment and went back to work. She thought about 3 years of accumulation, the weight of it, the cost of it, the specific price of being extraordinary in conditions designed to make you invisible. She thought about the parking structure mornings and the second column and the things she had kept in the wrong category for so long that the categories had grown permanent walls. She thought about the walls coming down. Not all at once. That was not how it worked, not how any of it worked. A wall removed at a time, in the order you were ready for it, at the pace that allowed the structure to remain standing while it changed. She thought about standing. Ji-ho was beside her, and not touching her, and she could feel the specific warmth of him at that distance, the 3-year familiarity of his proximity in a new configuration. And she thought about the column and the conversation about it at the small restaurant, and the way next week had become a unit of measurement that meant something specific to both of them. She reached out. She put her hand in his. He did not react dramatically. He was Ji-ho. He did not do dramatic reactions to things that were significant to him. I was still for one moment, and then his hand closed around hers with the particular deliberateness of a man who is certain about what he is holding and does not intend to be careless with it. They stood together in the room. Not boss and secretary. Not the story the building had told about them, or the story Han's apparatus had tried to write, or the story that Sarah had believed before she understood she had been taught what to believe. Not any story that required a hidden mechanism to explain. Just two people who had spent a long time learning to see each other clearly, standing in a room full of other people's complexity, holding on to something real. The evening continued. The city outside moved in its indifferent way. The lights held steady. The room was loud with the sound of the world conducting its business, which did not stop for anything. Not for reckonings, not for reorganizations, not for the quiet seismic shift of two people deciding that the distance between them had become the wrong distance. It did not stop, and they did not need it to. Zora had learned, over 3 years in a building that processed power the way other buildings processed air, constantly, invisibly, as a condition of existence, that the thing that lasted was not the loudest thing. It was not the ballroom speech, or the torn resignation letter, or the moment the room stood up. Those were real. They mattered. But what they built toward was smaller than them, and quieter, and more durable. A Tuesday evening. A small restaurant. A book left on a desk with a note that said the argument in Chapter 7 is wrong, but interestingly wrong. A logistics arrangement noticed and not mentioned and simply correct. A hand reached for in a room full of people, taken without ceremony, held without performance. The things that lasted were the things that did not require an audience. Zora already knew this. She had known it from the first morning she walked into the building with her leather portfolio and her travel mug, and her complete absence of a safety net, and began building, in the invisible way of people who understand that the work is the point, and the recognition is separate from the work, and arrives or doesn't arrive on its own schedule. She had built it. It had lasted. She had stood beside it through the attempts to dismantle it, and it was still standing, and she was still standing, and the man beside her had turned out to be a different shape than the shape she had catalogued for 3 years, larger in some places, more fractured in others, more capable of the kind of change that cost something than she had credited him with being. She had been wrong about some things. She could afford to say that now. His hand was warm. The room was loud. Outside, 42 floors below and a city block from any building she was connected to, the night moved through its ordinary second half without asking anything from anyone inside. She stood, and she did not manage anything. She was simply there. It was enough, and it was exactly enough. And it had been enough from the very first day. She had always been enough. She had simply been in a place that could not see it, and the place had slowly, expensively, and not without real damage, learned to. That was not a small